There are places where the stone remembers what the scrolls forgot. Long before the first character was scratched into oracle bone, long before the Shang kings consulted their tortoise shells, or the Zhou scribes compiled their chronicles, there were builders, there were engineers, there were dreamers whose names dissolved into the yellow dust of the central plains, leaving behind only the impossible weight of their work. Structures so strange, so deliberate, so far beyond what we expect from their age that they seem to belong to some other history entirely, one that runs parallel to ours, glimpsed only in fragments, in shadows, in the stubborn persistence of shaped stone and forged bronze. This is a journey into that older world. Not the China of emperors and dynasties, but something earlier, something deeper. A landscape of riddles carved into mountains, of cities drowned beneath engineered floods, of metal faces staring out from darkness with eyes that saw a cosmos we no longer recognize. These are the sites that predate history's memory, the places already ancient when Chinese civilization first began writing itself down. The Beigong pipes, threaded through rock that should never have known metal. The pyramids standing silent in the shadow of Xi'an, older perhaps than any tomb the tour guides speak of. Sanxingdui's bronze giants, their features alien and serene, clutching objects whose purpose remains forever just out of reach. Liangzhu's flooded canals, an engineering marvel submerged beneath centuries of mud and forgetting. Shimao's fortress walls studded with jade and something darker still. The Longyu caves, hand-carved from living sandstone in volumes that beggar belief. What civilization built these wonders? What knowledge guided their hands? And why, when the Bronze Age dawned in the Central Plains, did that knowledge seem to vanish? Not conquered, not replaced, but simply withdrawn, as if it had never wished to be remembered at all. Sit back. Let the modern world fall away, and let us step together into these hours of wonder, these hours of questions without comfortable answers, these hours in the company of stones that still whisper to those patient enough to listen. Our journey begins in the remote highlands of Qinghai province, where the air thins and the sky presses down with a weight all its own. Here, at the edge of the Tibetan plateau, the land rises in broken shelves of rust-coloured rock, scarred by wind and time and the slow grinding of geological ages. Few travellers venture this far from the arterial highways that bind China's coast to its interior. Fewer still have reason to linger near the shores of a salt lake called Tosunhu, where the water lies flat and metallic under a sky that seems somehow closer than it should be. Yet it is here, in this landscape of elemental desolation, that one of the strangest discoveries of the modern era waits beneath the surface of a sandstone hill. They are called the Beigong pipes. The first accounts emerged in the late 20th century when surveyors and geologists began cataloguing the mineral resources of this sparsely populated region. What they found defied easy explanation. Embedded within the rock of Mount Beigong, protruding from cave walls and scattered across the shoreline of the adjacent lake, were metallic tubes, some as thin as needles, others as wide as a man's arm, their surfaces oxidized to the colours of rust and verdigris. The pipes ran deep into the stone, threading through solid rock at angles that suggested intentionality, that whispered of design. Some emerged from the cave ceiling and plunged into the floor. Others snaked along horizontal planes before vanishing into darkness. Still others lay half buried in the sand at the water's edge, as if they had once carried something. Water, perhaps, or gas, or substances we cannot name, from the mountain's heart to the lake below. Initial analysis dated the surrounding rock to periods far older than any known metalworking culture in the region. The mountain itself belongs to formations laid down in epochs when, according to conventional understanding, no human hand had yet learned to shape bronze, let alone forge the iron-rich alloys that the pipes appeared to contain. Laboratory studies returned confusing results. Some samples suggested ferrous compounds consistent with natural geological processes, the kind of tubular concretions that can form when organic matter decays within sediment, leaving behind mineral casts of roots or reeds. Others contained trace elements, nickel, chromium, even radioactive isotopes, that seem to argue against purely natural origins. Mainstream geology offers an explanation. It speaks of fossilized plant roots, of tree trunks buried in ancient sediments and slowly replaced by iron-rich minerals over tens of thousands of years. It points to similar formations found in Louisiana, in New Zealand, in scattered locations around the globe where the chemistry of groundwater and the patience of deep time have conspired to create metal-like structures from once living wood. The bygone pipes, according to this reading, are remarkable but not mysterious. Natural curiosities misinterpreted by sensationalist media and fringe theorists hungry for evidence of lost civilizations or extraterrestrial visitors. And yet, the arrangement troubles those who have seen it firsthand. The pipes do not meander in the organic, chaotic patterns one would expect from fossilized roots. They run straight. They branch at angles that suggest engineering, not botany. They connect, or appear to connect, distinct chambers within the cave system to the body of the lake outside. The largest cave, triangular in cross-section, contains pipes that seem to pierce its walls with purpose, as if the stone itself had been chosen, surveyed, prepared to receive them. Standing at the entrance of that cave, with the thin highland wind cutting across the plateau and the salt lake glittering in the distance, one cannot help but feel that these formations were placed here, that they represent the remnants of some system, some infrastructure, built by hands that understood flow, pressure, delivery. How did metal, or metal-like mineral structures, come to thread through rock this old? If they are natural, why do they appear so regular, so deliberately aligned? If they are artificial, who could have built them in a place this remote, in an age before cities, before writing, before the wheel rolled across the steppes of Asia? Were they conduits for water, for drainage, for some industrial process lost to time? Or were they something stranger still? Relics of a technology we do not yet have categories to describe. The bygone pipes have no answers to offer. They simply wait, embedded in their mountain, threaded through stone that remembers nothing of who placed them there or why. And the lake below continues its slow evaporation under the Qinghai sun, its waters growing saltier with each passing century, as if time itself were distilling the mystery down to its most concentrated form. From the highlands of the west our path turns eastward, dropping down from the thin air of the plateau into the broad, populated valleys of Shanxi province. Here the land softens. The soil deepens to the rich, wind-blown loess that has nourished Chinese agriculture for millennia. And here, in the shadow of one of the world's most famous archaeological sites, another enigma waits, one that most visitors pass without ever noticing, their attention fixed on the terracotta soldiers that stand in regimented silence just a few kilometers away. The pyramids of Xi'an. The word itself carries freight. We think of Egypt, of Giza, of the great stepped monuments of Mesoamerica. But China too has its pyramids, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, scattered across the Wei River Valley and the plains surrounding the ancient capitals of the Zhou, Qin, Han, and Tang dynasties. Most are attributed to imperial burials, to the mausolea of kings and emperors whose tombs were marked by earthen mounds, raised in deliberate geometric forms. The practice is well documented. The literary sources confirm it. The Han Dynasty tombs, in particular, were often surmounted by flat-topped pyramidal structures, their sides aligned to the cardinal directions, their heights carefully calibrated to reflect the status and aspirations of those buried beneath. And yet, some of the mounds in this region do not fit neatly into the historical framework. They are larger, vastly larger than the known imperial tombs. They are older, their surfaces eroded by millennia of wind and rain into shapes that suggest far greater antiquity than the Bronze Age dynasties that supposedly constructed them. They are oriented with a precision that seems almost obsessive, their corners aligned to true north, with deviations so small that modern surveyors have struggled to explain how such accuracy could have been achieved without sophisticated instruments, and they are clustered in patterns that resist easy interpretation, as if they were positioned not merely to mark individual graves, but to participate in some larger design, a landscape-scale geometry whose purpose remains obscure. Conventional archaeology identifies the largest of these structures as the Miaoling Mausoleum, the tomb of Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty, or the burial mound of the first emperor himself, whose terracotta army guards his underground palace just to the east. But local traditions speak of far older constructions, of heavenly mountains raised by kings whose names were never recorded in any chronicle. Aerial photographs taken over the past century reveal mounds that do not correspond to any known burial, structures that appear on no official register, hills that look suspiciously regular in outline but have never been excavated or systematically surveyed. The Chinese government, understandably, has been cautious. The tomb of the first emperor alone is believed to contain a Mercury river, a miniature replica of his empire and treasures beyond imagination, and it remains unopened, protected by both law and the practical difficulties of excavating a site that may still be dangerously toxic. The other mounds, less famous but equally mysterious, have received even less attention. Some are planted with crops, others have been quarried for construction material. Still others simply sit, massive and silent, their surfaces overgrown with scrub grass, their interiors unknown. What lies beneath them? If they are tombs, whose bones rest within? If they are not tombs, what purpose did they serve? Why were they built in such deliberate alignment with such monumental effort in an age when the population of the region could barely have supported the labour required? And why do some of them appear, according to local tradition and scattered reports from early Western visitors, to predate the earliest dynasties by centuries, even millennia? The pyramids of Xi'an do not speak. They have no inscriptions, no cartouches, no identifying markers that survive the ages. They are simply there, rising from the lowest plains like the fossilized spines of buried giants, their presence a challenge to every neat narrative of Chinese history that begins with the Shang, with the Zhou, with the comforting progression of dynasties that the textbooks describe. Perhaps they are exactly what mainstream archaeology claims: imperial tombs built by known rulers, awaiting only the resources and political will to be properly excavated. Or perhaps they are older, stranger, remnants of a civilization that flourished and vanished before the first character was ever brushed onto silk. Standing among them with the haze of Xi'an's modern sprawl visible on the horizon and the weight of millennia pressing down from the silent mounds, one feels the presence of a question that has no comfortable answer. Who were the first builders of this land? What did they know? And why did their memory fade so completely that even their monuments became invisible, absorbed into the landscape like stones swallowed by rising water? Our journey continues southward now, across the Qinling Mountains and down into the humid basin of Sichuan, where the rivers run slow and the mist hangs thick over jade-green paddies. This is a land of abundance, of moisture, of life that proliferates in every direction. A land that has supported dense populations for as long as humans have farmed in East Asia. And yet, for all its familiarity, Sichuan guards a secret that overturned nearly everything scholars thought they knew about the origins of Chinese civilization: Sanxingdui. The name means three-star mound, a reference to the three low earthen rises that local farmers had known for generations, ploughing around them, occasionally turning up fragments of jade or bronze that they sold to antiquities dealers or kept as curiosities. For centuries, these fragments circulated through the networks of collectors and scholars, attributed to the Shang dynasty, to the Zhou, to unknown local cultures of no great significance. No one suspected what lay beneath. And then, in 1986, workers at a nearby brick factory struck something hard. They were digging clay from a pit when their shovels rang against metal, and the earth began to yield objects that no one had ever seen before. The excavations that followed revealed two massive sacrificial pits, crammed with artifacts of staggering artistry and profound strangeness. Bronze heads, dozens of them, their features elongated and angular, their eyes protruding in exaggerated almond shapes, their expression serene and somehow inhuman. Gold masks beaten thin and fitted over bronze faces, their surfaces still gleaming after 3,000 years in the earth. Jade blades, stone axes, elephant tusks carved with geometric patterns, bronze trees whose branches supported flowers and birds and strange hybrid creatures that belonged to no naturalist's catalogue, and standing among them, the giants, bronze statues of human figures, nearly 3 meters tall, their arms extended as if holding invisible objects, their faces gazing outward with an intensity that seems to pierce the veil between their world and ours. Nothing like this had ever been found in China, nothing in the Shang heartland, nothing in the Zhou ritual centres, nothing in the entire corpus of known Chinese Bronze Age art suggested that such a culture had existed. The style was utterly distinct. The faces bore no resemblance to the rounded naturalistic features of Shang bronzes. The iconography followed no pattern that scholars could trace to any known tradition. The sheer scale of the ritual deposit implied a level of wealth and organization that rivaled the great dynasties of the Central Plains. And yet, according to the radiocarbon dates, Sanxingdui flourished contemporaneously with the Shang, perhaps even earlier, a parallel civilization hidden in the Sichuan basin, conducting rituals of incomprehensible meaning around pits, filled with treasures that they chose, for reasons unknown, to bury and burn. Who were these people? The later literary sources, compiled centuries after the fact, speak vaguely of the kingdom of Shu, a semi-legendary state that supposedly occupied the Sichuan region before the Xin conquest in the 4th century BCE. But the Shu of the texts are a shadowy presence, peripheral characters in histories written by their conquerors, remembered only for their eventual absorption into the expanding Chinese world. The Sanxingdui culture predates even these dim references by 1,000 years or more. It belongs to an era before writing reached this region, before any chronicle recorded its existence, before anyone thought to ask what civilization might have flourished in the misty valleys west of the Central Plains. The bronze figures offer tantalizing clues. Their posture, arms extended, hands positioned as if gripping cylindrical objects, has prompted speculation that they once held something, perhaps elephant tusks, perhaps ritual staffs, perhaps items so sacred or so dangerous that they were deliberately removed before the statues were buried. The smallest figures wear elaborate headdresses. The largest stands bareheaded, its scalp flattened into a strange, artificial shape. Were these representations of priests, kings, gods themselves, cast in metal and worshipped in temples that have long since crumbled to dust? The gold masks, too, resist easy interpretation. In Egypt, in Mycenae, in the burial traditions of many ancient cultures, gold masks covered the faces of the dead, preserving their features for eternity. But the Sanxingdui masks do not seem to represent death. They are fitted over bronze heads that are themselves stylized, abstract, clearly not intended as portraits of specific individuals. They seem instead to transform, to elevate, to mark the wearer as something more than human. The gold gleams even now after millennia, with a luster that suggests not mere decoration but investiture, the conferral of some status beyond the mortal. And then there is the manner of their burial. The pits were not tombs. No bodies have been found in them. Instead, they appear to be sacrificial deposits, offerings perhaps to gods whose names are lost, or acts of ritual destruction that followed the death of a king, the fall of a dynasty, the end of an age. The objects were not carefully arranged but thrown into the pits in apparent haste, many of them deliberately broken or burned before burial. The elephant tusks were charred. The bronze faces were smashed. The great standing figures were toppled, their arms snapped off, their bodies consigned to the flames. What event could have prompted such destruction? What crisis, what catastrophe, what sacred obligation led the people of Sanxingdui to gather their most precious possessions and cast them into the earth? Were they fleeing an enemy, sealing their holy things against desecration? Were they enacting a cosmic ritual, returning to the ground what the ground had given? Or were they simply ending, deliberately, consciously choosing to erase their own culture rather than see it corrupted or conquered? The excavations continue. In recent years, additional pits have been discovered, their contents even more extraordinary. Golden birds, ivory carvings, a bronze altar that seems to depict a cosmological diagram of heaven, earth, and the realms between. Each new discovery deepens the mystery rather than resolving it. The people of Sanxingdui left no writing, no inscriptions, no explanatory texts. They left only these objects, these strange and beautiful artifacts that speak of a world we cannot enter, a belief system we cannot decode, a civilization that rose and flourished and vanished while the dynasties of the Central Plains were still finding their footing. Standing before those bronze faces in the museum that now houses them, one feels the weight of 3,000 years pressing down, and something older still, something that gazes back with eyes that never close, that never blink, that seem to ask, "Do you remember us? We were here. We were here before your history began, and we chose, in the end, to bury everything we made, to burn everything we loved, to leave you nothing but questions." The mist of Sichuan clings to the memory as our path turns eastward once more, following the course of the Yangtze toward the coastal lowlands where China meets the sea. Here, in the flat, waterlogged plains south of modern Shanghai, another vanished civilization awaits, one that shaped not only bronze and jade but the very landscape itself, engineering on a scale that the ancient world rarely matched. This is Liangzhu. The name refers both to a culture and to a site, a nexus of archaeological discoveries centered on the Hangzhou Bay region of Zhejiang province. For most of the 20th century, Liangzhu was known primarily for its jade, the exquisite bee discs and Kong tubes that appeared in museums and collections around the world, their surfaces incised with mysterious patterns, their provenance often murky, their age a matter of scholarly debate. The jade alone was remarkable, worked with a precision that seemed to require metal tools and yet predated, according to all available evidence, the arrival of bronze in the region by 1,000 years or more. But the jade was only the beginning. As excavations expanded in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the true scope of Liangzhu began to emerge. This was not merely a site, but a complex, a city, a state, a hydraulic civilization that had mastered the management of water on a scale that would not be seen again in China until the construction of the Grand Canal more than 3,000 years later. The archaeologists found walls, massive ramparts of stamped earth reinforced with stone, enclosing an urban core of nearly 300 hectares. They found palaces, or structures that appeared to serve palatial functions, raised on platforms of carefully engineered fill. They found workshops, residential areas, ritual centres, and they found the dams. Stretching across the hills to the northwest of the city, a system of earthen embankments controlled the flow of water from the surrounding mountains, directing it into reservoirs, channeling it through canals, managing the floods that would otherwise have made this low-lying region uninhabitable. The scale was astonishing. The longest dam extended for nearly 5 kilometres, its construction requiring the movement of millions of cubic metres of earth. The engineering was sophisticated, employing different techniques for different sections depending on the local geology, the slope of the terrain, the anticipated water pressure. The system was, in short, a triumph of planning, coordination and sustained effort. A project that would have demanded the labour of thousands over years, perhaps generations, all directed toward the single goal of taming the waters that threatened and sustained their civilization. Radiocarbon dating places the height of Liangzhu culture between roughly 3,300 and 2,300 BCE, making it contemporary with the early phases of ancient Egypt, with the rise of Mesopotamian urbanism, with Stonehenge and the megalithic monuments of Western Europe. And yet, for most of recorded Chinese history, Liangzhu was entirely unknown. No chronicle mentioned it. No legend preserved its memory. Its jade was prized, collected, attributed to various periods and cultures, but no one suspected that it came from a unified civilization, a state with cities and palaces and monumental engineering that had flourished and vanished more than 1,000 years before the first character was scratched into bone in the Shang heartland. What happened to them? The archaeological record suggests a catastrophic end. Around 2300 BCE, the site shows signs of abandonment, not gradual decline but sudden cessation, as if the population simply left or perished. The dams were breached, the canals silted up. The city was swallowed by the very waters it had spent centuries learning to control. Some scholars point to climate change, to a period of increased rainfall and flooding that overwhelmed the hydraulic infrastructure. Others suggest social collapse, the failure of a centralized elite to maintain the systems upon which their power depended. Still others wonder if epidemic, war, or some environmental disaster not yet understood might have driven the Liangzhu people from their homeland. Whatever the cause, they did not return. The jade workshops fell silent. The ritual centers were abandoned. The great walls crumbled and were buried beneath layers of silt and sediment, invisible to the farmers who would, millennia later, plant their rice paddies over the forgotten city. And when Chinese civilization arose in the Central Plains, when the Shang kings conducted their divinations and the Zhou scribes compiled their annals, no memory of Liangzhu survived. It was as if a door had closed, as if an entire chapter of the past had been redacted from the record, leaving only this jade, beautiful, mysterious, inexplicable, to hint at what had been lost. Today the site is a UNESCO World Heritage Monument, its dams and walls carefully excavated and preserved. Visitors can walk the ancient embankments, can trace the course of the canals, can stand where the Liangzhu elite once stood and survey the landscape they reshaped. But the questions remain. How did they organize such labor without bronze, without writing, without the bureaucratic tools that later civilizations would develop to manage complex projects? What beliefs drove them to invest so heavily in jade, a material that has no practical use, that cannot be eaten or worn for warmth, that serves only ritual, aesthetic, spiritual purposes? And why, when their civilization ended, did no successor culture preserve their knowledge, their techniques, their memory? The flooded canals of Liangzhu are silent now, their waters long since drained or diverted, their beds dry and exposed to the archaeological sun. But the silence is not empty. It is full of the presence of those who once lived here, who once dug these channels with tools of stone and bone, who once placed their jade offerings in graves that would not be opened for 5,000 years. They are not forgotten, not anymore. But they remain unknown, their names lost, their language unrecovered, their story written only in the shapes they carved into the earth and the stones they polished to impossible perfection. Our journey presses northward now, climbing out of the coastal lowlands and into the rugged terrain of northern Shanxi, where the Yellow River carves its looping path through canyons of yellow loess, and the wind carries the dust of ages. This is harsh country, beautiful in its severity, marked by sudden ravines and isolated plateaus, where fortified settlements once commanded views for miles in every direction. And here, on a highland overlooking the junction of two rivers, stands a city that rewrote the prehistory of China, Shimao. For most of the 20th century, the site was known only as a fragment of ancient wall, noted by local officials, occasionally visited by curious archaeologists, never systematically studied. The assumption was that it dated to the historical period, perhaps a frontier garrison of the Zhou or Qin, perhaps a fortification from one of the many wars that swept through this region over the millennia. The wall was impressive, certainly, built of carefully fitted stone blocks in a landscape where most ancient structures were made of stamped earth. But it seemed isolated, anomalous, a curiosity without context. Then, in 2011, a comprehensive survey revealed the truth. The wall fragment was not isolated. It was part of a vast complex, a stepped pyramid, a palace district, residential quarters, defensive walls extending for kilometres across the highland terrain. The site covered more than 400 hectares. It was, by a considerable margin, the largest fortified settlement of its age anywhere in East Asia, and it dated, according to radiocarbon analysis, to roughly 2300 to 1800 BCE, the same twilight period when Liangzhu was collapsing in the south, when the Shang dynasty had not yet arisen in the central plains, when Chinese prehistory was supposed to be a scattered collection of Neolithic villages without cities, without states, without monumental architecture. Shimao changed everything. The stepped pyramid at the centre of the complex rises in 11 tiers, its summit once crowned with a palatial structure whose post holes still mark the earth. The walls are built of fitted stone, their faces originally plastered and painted, their construction requiring skills and organisation that no one had suspected existed in this period. The city was defended not merely by walls but by a sophisticated system of gates and bastions, designed to channel attackers into killing zones, to control access, to project power across the surrounding landscape. And then there was the jade. Like Liangzhu, like Sanxingdui, like so many of these pre-dynastic sites, Shimao yielded jade, but not in graves, not in sacrificial pits. The jade at Shimao was embedded in the walls themselves, hundreds of jade artifacts inserted into the foundation stones of the city's defences. Blades, discs, sceptres, objects of clear ritual significance, all deliberately placed within the masonry, as if the walls were not merely functional but sacred, as if the very act of building was a religious rite, as if the jade was meant to protect, to consecrate, to bind the stones together with something more than mortar. Why? What belief system demanded that precious jade be hidden within walls, invisible to human eyes, serving no decorative or practical purpose? Was it apotropaic, intended to ward off evil spirits or enemy attacks? Was it dedicatory, an offering to the gods who watched over the city? Or was it something else entirely, a practice whose logic we cannot reconstruct, a ritual whose meaning died with the people who performed it? And there was something darker still. In the foundations of the gates, in pits near the walls, archaeologists found human skulls. Dozens of them, young women primarily, their heads separated from their bodies, their remains placed deliberately beneath the stones. These were not burials, they were sacrifices, foundation deposits meant to sanctify the construction, to appease forces unknown, to purchase with blood the protection that jade alone could not guarantee. The practice of human sacrifice in ancient China is documented in the Shang period, when kings were accompanied to the afterlife by hundreds of attendants, when prisoners of war were slaughtered in rituals that shocked even the Zhou scribes who later conquered the Shang heartland. But Shimao predates the Shang by centuries. Its sacrifices belong to an earlier tradition, a prehistory of violence and devotion that the later chronicles never acknowledged, a darkness buried beneath the foundations of civilization itself. What was Shimao? A city-state, certainly, the capital of some unknown polity that controlled this highland region for half a millennium or more. But whose polity? What people built this place, governed it, conducted their rituals of jade and blood, and then abandoned it to the wind and the wolves? The site shows signs of deliberate destruction around 1800 BCE. Its buildings burned, its walls broken, its population dispersed or absorbed by conquering groups whose identity remains unknown. By the time the Shang arose in the Central Plains, by the time Chinese history proper began, Shimao was already a ruin, its very existence forgotten, its walls crumbling into the loess from which they had been raised. The excavations continue. Each season reveals new structures, new artifacts, new questions. The jade-studded walls, the sacrificial pits, the stepped pyramid gazing out over the river valleys. They all speak of power, of belief, of a civilization sophisticated enough to command armies and complex enough to develop its own ritual language. But they do not speak in words we can understand. They speak only in stone, in jade, in the silent testimony of skulls buried beneath thresholds. And the wind that sweeps across the Shimao Plateau carries no answers, only dust, only time, only the endless patience of a landscape that has seen empires rise and fall, and asks nothing of those who come to dig among the ruins. From the highlands of the north, our path descends one final time, southward and eastward, back toward the coastal regions where the modern world presses closest against the ancient. In Zhejiang province, not far from the commercial bustle of contemporary China, lies a site that should not exist, a place where the impossible was carved from living rock chamber by chamber in volumes that stagger the imagination, the Liangzhu caves. Discovered in 1992, when a local farmer named Wu Anai began draining water from what he thought was a bottomless pond, the caves are unlike anything else on Earth. There are at least 36 of them, perhaps more, carved into the sandstone hills near the village of Xianbekun. Each is a vast subterranean chamber, roughly rectangular in plan, with soaring ceilings supported by massive pillars left in place as the surrounding rock was excavated. The walls are not smooth but covered with parallel chisel marks, incised at a consistent angle of 60 degrees, creating a pattern that ripples across every surface like the striations of some colossal fingerprint. The scale defies casual comprehension. The largest caves exceed 1,000 square meters in floor area. The ceilings rise more than 30 meters above the floor. The total volume of rock removed from all the caves combined has been estimated at nearly 1 million cubic meters, the equivalent of excavating a small mountain, one chisel stroke at a time. And yet, before Wu and I drained that first flooded chamber, no one knew they existed. There is no mention of the Liangzhu caves in any historical record. No chronicle, no local gazetteer, no traveller's account describes their construction or their purpose. The villages above them have been inhabited for centuries, their residents entirely unaware that beneath their feet lay caverns of such magnitude. The caves were filled with water, their entrances sealed or silted over, their very memory erased from human consciousness, until a curious farmer decided to see what lay at the bottom of his pond. Who built them? The conventional estimate places their construction sometime between the Warring States period and the Han Dynasty, roughly 200 BCE to 200 CE, give or take a century. This would make them roughly contemporary with the Terracotta Army, with the great engineering projects of the first emperor, with the flourishing of classical Chinese civilization. But the evidence is circumstantial, based on tool marks and geological inference, rather than direct dating or documentary confirmation. Some researchers have argued for an earlier date, pushing the caves back into the pre-imperial period, into the same murky era that produced Sanxingdui and Liangzhu and Shimao. Others have suggested that the caves were carved over many generations, their excavation beginning in one era and continuing intermittently across centuries or even millennia. What were they for? The chambers contain no inscriptions, no artifacts, no clues to their intended function. They are simply voids, perfectly carved, meticulously finished and utterly empty. Some scholars have proposed that they were storage facilities, underground granaries capable of holding vast quantities of food against famine or siege. Others suggest quarrying operations, the extraction of stone for construction projects elsewhere. Still others have speculated about ritual purposes, about underground temples, about chambers designed to house the dead or to commune with the spirits of the earth. But none of these explanations fully satisfies. The chisel marks, regular and consistent across every surface, suggest a concern for aesthetics that mere quarrying would not require. The pillars, left in place to support the ceilings, are not rough remnants but shaped and finished, their surfaces bearing the same 60-degree striations as the walls. The scale of the project, the millions of labour hours required, the coordination of workers, the removal and disposal of the excavated rock, implies a level of organisation and resources that should have left some trace in the historical record. And yet there is nothing. Silence. Amnesia. 1 million cubic metres of stone removed from the earth, and no one remembered it happened. Standing in the largest of the Liangzhu caves with the ceiling receding into darkness above and the chisel marks covering every visible surface, one feels a vertigo that has nothing to do with height. It is the vertigo of lost time, of effort that should have been commemorated and was instead forgotten, of hands that shaped this space and then vanished without leaving so much as a name. The caves ask questions that have no answers. Why were they carved? Why were they abandoned? Why, in a culture that kept meticulous records, did no one write a single word about their existence? The sandstone walls do not reply. They simply wait, as they have waited for centuries for someone to understand what they once meant, and what it means that we have forgotten. From Liangzhu, our journey turns westward, following the Qiantang River toward its sources in the highlands, then pressing on across the fractured terrain of interior China, where mountains give way to basins and basins yield to plateaus, where the land itself seems to fold and refold like cloth laid down by careless hands. We travel not merely through space but through time, backward through the dynasties that would later claim this territory, backward past the empires and the kingdoms, past the bronze and the jade, past the written word itself, until we arrive at a place where even the categories we use to understand the past begin to dissolve. Our destination lies in the remote northwest, in the province of Qinghai, where the Tibetan plateau meets the Qaidam basin and the air thins to a clarity that makes distant peaks seem close enough to touch. Here, in a landscape of salt flats and alkaline lakes, of scrubland and stone, stands a formation that should not exist, a geological anomaly that has generated speculation far beyond what its modest scale might suggest. The Baigong pipes, as they have come to be called, were not discovered by archaeologists or geologists, but by a group of scientists searching for something else entirely. In the late 1990s, researchers investigating the mineral deposits of the Qaidam Basin stumbled upon a peculiar formation near the shore of a seasonal lake called Tosunhu. Rising from the barren ground was a small pyramid-shaped hill, perhaps 60 metres high, composed of the same reddish-brown sandstone that characterises much of this region. On its southern face, 3 caves opened into the rock, their mouths irregular but clearly defined against the surrounding stone. The caves themselves were unremarkable, shallow depressions rather than true caverns, extending only a few metres into the hillside before terminating in solid rock. What drew the researchers' attention was not the caves, but what they found inside them. Embedded in the stone floor, protruding from the walls and running along the cave ceilings were dozens of pipe-like structures, cylindrical formations of varying diameter, some as thin as a needle, others as wide as a human arm, all composed of a reddish-brown material that appeared at first glance to be rusted metal. The pipes were not uniform. Some ran in straight lines, maintaining their diameter over considerable lengths. Others curved and branched, splitting into smaller tubes or merging with neighbouring formations. Some protruded from the rock at odd angles, their ends broken or eroded, while others disappeared into the stone as if continuing deep into the mountain's interior. Outside the caves, similar formations could be found scattered across the lakeshore and partially submerged in the shallow saline waters of Tosunhu itself. Analysis of the pipe material revealed a composition that only deepened the mystery. The formations were primarily iron oxide, rust, essentially the product of iron exposed to oxygen and water over extended periods, but mixed with the iron oxide were traces of silicon dioxide, calcium oxide, and other minerals consistent with the local geology. Most puzzling of all was the presence of organic material within the pipes, plant debris, according to some analyses, suggesting that the formations had somehow incorporated biological matter during their creation. The conventional explanation, the one favoured by most geologists who have examined the site, attributes the Baigong pipes to a natural process called diagenesis, specifically to the fossilization of tree roots. According to this theory, ancient trees once grew in this region during a warmer, wetter climatic period, their roots extending deep into the sandy soil. When the climate shifted and the trees died, their roots decayed, leaving behind cylindrical voids in the sediment. Over time, iron-rich groundwater percolated through these voids, depositing iron oxides that gradually filled and preserved the shape of the original roots. The result was a network of iron-rich formations that preserved the branching, tubular structure of the root system, formations that to an untrained eye might resemble artificial pipes. This explanation is elegant, parsimonious, and consistent with known geological processes. It accounts for the irregular diameters, the branching patterns, the organic inclusions, and the presence of similar formations both inside the caves and scattered across the landscape. It requires no appeal to unknown technologies, no invocation of ancient engineers working in one of the most inhospitable regions on Earth, and yet, the Baigong pipes have become one of the most frequently cited examples of alleged prehistoric technology, featured in documentaries and websites devoted to ancient mysteries, held up as evidence of civilizations lost to time or interventions from beyond the stars. Why? Perhaps because the prosaic explanation, however well supported, fails to account for the visceral strangeness of standing before those caves and seeing what genuinely appear to be rusted pipes embedded in ancient stone. Perhaps because the human mind rebels against coincidence on such a scale, against the notion that natural processes could produce structures so suggestive of human artifice. Perhaps because there are details that the conventional explanation does not fully address. The pipes embedded in the cave walls, for instance, seem to follow straighter paths than one would expect from tree roots, which typically grow in response to obstacles and moisture gradients, curving and branching unpredictably. Some of the formations maintain remarkably consistent diameters over their entire length, a regularity that seems at odds with the organic variability of root systems. And then there is the question of age. If the pipes are fossilized tree roots, they must date to a period when trees could grow in this now barren landscape, a period that some estimates place as far back as 150,000 years ago, when the climate of the Kedam Basin was dramatically different from today. Other analyses have suggested more recent dates, anywhere from 5,000 to 50,000 years before the present. But even the youngest of these estimates places the formations well before any known human habitation of the region. Could it be that the explanation is correct in its essentials but incomplete in its details? Could there be aspects of the Baigong formation that remain unexplained, not because they require appeals to ancient technology, but because the natural processes involved are more complex than we yet understand? The pipes remain embedded in their hillside, neither conclusively natural nor demonstrably artificial, a small enigma in a landscape full of larger questions. They do not demand belief in lost civilizations, but they do remind us that the Earth is capable of producing forms that challenge our assumptions, that nature itself can be an artist of deception, sculpting shapes that mimic the work of hands that never touched them. From the alkaline shores of Tosunhu, our path turns eastward and southward, descending from the plateau toward the Wei River Valley, where the Sinling Mountains march in parallel ridges toward the sea and the land softens into the Los Plains that would one day cradle Chinese civilization. Here, near the ancient capital of Xi'an, a city that has borne many names across the millennia, that has served as the seat of emperors and the terminus of trade routes stretching to Rome itself, the landscape conceals another category of enigma. They are called the Pyramids of Xi'an, though pyramid is perhaps too precise a term for structures whose forms have blurred across centuries of erosion, cultivation, and deliberate landscaping. Rising from the flat farmland west and north of the city are dozens of mound-like elevations, their slopes covered with crops and fruit trees, their summits flattened by time and human activity. To the casual observer, they might appear to be natural hills, gentle rises in an otherwise level terrain. But their shapes are too regular, their orientations too consistent, their distribution too patterned to be accidents of geology. They are artificial constructions, burial mounds, in all probability tombs of royalty and nobility from dynasties whose names have largely been forgotten. The largest and most famous is the Maoling, the tomb of Emperor Wu of Han, who ruled for more than half a century and extended Chinese power deeper into Central Asia than any ruler before him. At nearly 50 meters in height and covering an area of more than 50 acres, the Maoling is one of the largest burial mounds in China, a monument to an emperor whose ambitions reshaped the ancient world. Other mounds belong to rulers of the Western Zhou, to queens and consorts and favoured ministers, to generals whose victories are recorded in bronze inscriptions and scholars whose texts survived into the age of paper. These tombs are known. Their occupants, in many cases, can be identified. Their construction can be dated with reasonable confidence to the historical periods when Chinese civilization was already flourishing, already literate, already integrated into the dynastic succession that would continue, with interruptions, for more than 2,000 years. And yet there are other mounds, other elevations in this landscape, whose origins are less certain. Some predate the historical dynasties entirely, their construction lost in the murky period before written records became comprehensive. Others are simply unexcavated, their interiors sealed behind tons of earth, their secrets preserved by the same soil that hides them from view. The Chinese government has been notably cautious about excavating these sites, wary of the damage that exposure to air and light can cause to fragile artifacts, mindful of the lessons learned from premature excavations elsewhere. The tomb of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, lies beneath its mound near Xi'an, its legendary contents. The rivers of Mercury, the map of the empire, the treasures beyond counting, still waiting in darkness, untouched since the day the last workers sealed the entrance and departed. What lies beneath the other mounds? In the absence of excavation, speculation flourishes. Some researchers have suggested that the largest of the pyramidal mounds near Xi'an rival or exceed the Great Pyramid of Giza in their base dimensions, though their eroded profiles make precise measurements difficult. Others have pointed to the consistent orientation of the mounds, their alignment along north-south axes, or their positioning relative to celestial phenomena, as evidence of sophisticated astronomical knowledge embedded in their design. Still others have noted the sheer number of mounds, hundreds, by some counts, scattered across the Wei River Valley and its tributaries, and asked what civilization could have commanded the resources to construct so many monumental tombs, over how many generations, and to what ultimate purpose. The conventional answer places most of these constructions within the historical period, attributing them to the various dynasties that made Xi'an and its predecessors their capital, the Zhou, the Qin, the Han, the Tang. This answer is almost certainly correct for the majority of the mounds, whose forms and locations correspond to known tomb-building practices, and whose construction can be tentatively dated through associated artifacts or documentary references. But the conventional answer does not account for all of the mounds, particularly those whose eroded profiles and anomalous locations suggest greater antiquity. It does not explain why some mounds lack the satellite burials and surrounding features typical of dynastic tombs, or why others have yielded surface materials that seem inconsistent with historical period construction. And it does not address the persistent local traditions, the stories passed down through generations of farmers who have tilled this soil, of mounds that were already ancient when the first emperors arrived, of tombs built by peoples whose names were lost before history began to be written. Are these traditions accurate, preserving genuine memories of pre-dynastic construction? Or are they the inevitable mythologies that accumulate around any mysterious feature of the landscape, the human tendency to push the unknown backward into the depths of time? The mounds themselves offer no testimony. They simply rise from the farmland, their slopes planted with wheat and corn, their summits crowned with orchards, patient monuments to builders who may have been emperors or who may have been peoples whose very existence has been erased from memory. What secrets do they keep? What bodies lie within? What treasures? What texts that might rewrite our understanding of early Chinese civilization? The earth covers them all equally, making no distinction between the historical and the legendary, between the documented and the merely suspected. Only excavation could provide answers, and excavation has been deliberately, perhaps wisely, withheld. Leaving the mounds of Xi'an to their patient silence, we turn southwestward, following the tributaries of the Yangtze toward the Sichuan Basin, where the land descends into a vast, humid lowland ringed by mountains and fed by rivers that carry the snowmelt of distant peaks. This is one of the most fertile regions in China, a place where rice paddies have sustained dense populations for millennia, where the climate permits multiple harvests per year, where civilization has flourished since the earliest times of which we have record, and it is here, near the modern city of Guang'an, that the most spectacular discovery of 20th century Chinese archaeology overturned everything scholars thought they knew about the ancient past. The Sanxingdui site was not unknown before its major excavations. Farmers had been turning up jade and stone artifacts in the area since the 1920s, when a peasant repairing an irrigation ditch uncovered a cache of more than 300 jade and stone objects buried beneath his fields. Local collectors acquired some of these pieces, others made their way to museums in Chengdu and beyond. Archaeologists took note, recognizing the significance of the finds, but the political turmoil of the following decades — war, revolution, upheaval — delayed systematic investigation. It was not until 1986 that the true nature of Sanxingdui began to reveal itself, and when it did, the revelation was unlike anything Chinese archaeology had previously encountered. In July of that year, workers at a local brick factory unearthed a pit containing what appeared to be bronze artifacts. Archaeologists were summoned, excavations began, and within weeks the dimensions of the discovery became clear. The pit, designated Sacrificial Pit No. 1, contained more than 400 artifacts, jade implements, bronze vessels, gold objects, and most strikingly, bronze sculptures of a type never before seen in China. Massive heads with exaggerated features stared up from the soil, their eyes protruding like cylinders, their ears extended into wing-like projections, their expressions at once human and utterly alien. Standing figures, some nearly 2 meters tall, held their arms extended as if grasping objects now vanished, their bodies rendered in stylized bronze, their faces bearing the same bulging eyes as the detached heads. A life-sized bronze tree, its branches extending upward and outward, supported birds and strange ornaments whose symbolism defied immediate interpretation. A month later, a second pit was discovered nearby, containing even more remarkable finds. The centerpiece was a standing figure more than 2.6 meters tall, the largest bronze statue known from anywhere in the ancient world at that time, its hands positioned as if holding a ceremonial object, its face dominated by the same protruding cylindrical eyes that characterized all the Sanxingdui bronzes. Gold masks, some large enough to cover human faces, lay amid the debris. A gold staff, more than a meter long and covered with intricate carved designs, suggested royal or religious authority of a kind previously unknown in Bronze Age China. And everywhere, amid and beneath the treasures, were layers of burned bone, ash, and elephant tusks. Evidence that the pit's contents had been deliberately smashed, burned, and buried in what could only have been an act of ritual destruction. Who created these objects? The Sanxingdui culture, as it has come to be called, flourished during the late Shang Dynasty period, roughly 1700 to 1150 BCE, making it contemporary with the bronze-casting civilization centered at Anyang in the Yellow River Valley. But the Sanxingdui bronzes bear no resemblance to Shang artistic traditions. The Shang produced bronze vessels of extraordinary refinement, ritual wine containers, food vessels, ceremonial cauldrons, decorated with geometric patterns and stylized animal motifs that followed strict conventions. The Sanxingdui bronzes are figurative, representational, devoted to the human form in ways that have no parallel in contemporary Chinese art. Their style is so distinctive, so unlike anything else from the period, that some scholars initially questioned whether they could be genuinely ancient at all. But the evidence is overwhelming. Radiocarbon dating of the organic materials in the pits confirms their age. The casting techniques, while sophisticated, are consistent with Bronze Age technology. The associated artifacts, the jades, the pottery, the elephant tusks, correspond to known patterns of material culture from the period. The Sanxingdui culture was real, was ancient, and was producing monumental bronze sculpture at a time when no other civilization in China, and few civilizations anywhere in the world had achieved comparable mastery of the medium. How was this possible? Bronze casting on the scale of the Sanxingdui figures requires not merely technical skill but massive infrastructure. Mines to extract copper and tin, smelting facilities to produce the metal, workshops to create the moulds, kilns to fire them, labour to pour the molten bronze and finish the castings. The largest Sanxingdui bronzes would have required hundreds of kilograms of metal, coordinated effort by skilled craftsmen, and a surplus economy capable of supporting such non-productive labour. This implies a complex society, a stratified hierarchy, a governing authority capable of marshalling resources and directing large-scale projects. Yet the Sanxingdui culture left no written records that we can read, no inscriptions on its bronzes, no texts explaining its beliefs or its history. We do not know what these people called themselves, what language they spoke, what gods they worshipped, or why they created these extraordinary images and then destroyed them. The faces of the Sanxingdui bronzes haunt the imagination. Those protruding eyes, cylindrical and enormous, have no parallel in human physiognomy. Were they meant to represent masks, shamanic transformation, beings from realms beyond the ordinary? The extended ears, the sharp features, the expressions that seem to hover between human and something other. All of these details suggest a cosmology radically different from anything recorded in later Chinese tradition. Some scholars have proposed connections to Southeast Asian cultures, noting stylistic similarities with bronzes from Vietnam and Thailand. Others have suggested links to the steppes, to cultures that left no monuments, but whose influence might have travelled along trade routes we can no longer trace. Still others have simply acknowledged the mystery, confessing that Sanxingdui represents something genuinely new, a culture that arose, flourished and vanished without leaving descendants or successors who preserved its memory. What happened to them? Sometime around 1150 BCE, the Sanxingdui culture came to an end. The two sacrificial pits, with their smashed bronzes, their burned offerings, their deliberate destruction of wealth and beauty, may represent the final act of this vanishing, a ritual termination of a dynasty or a religion, a closing of accounts with whatever powers the Sanxingdui people served. After this, the centre of Sichuan Basin culture shifted to a nearby site called Jinsha, where some elements of Sanxingdui tradition continued, but where the great figurative bronzes were no longer produced. Within a few generations, the distinctive art of Sanxingdui had disappeared entirely, replaced by styles more consistent with broader Chinese developments, absorbed into the cultural mainstream that would eventually become the Zhou and then the Han. But absorption is not explanation. It does not tell us where the Sanxingdui style came from, why it developed in this particular place and time, or what it meant to the people who created it. It does not explain those eyes, those faces, those towering figures with their arms raised in gestures whose significance we cannot read. The bronzes now reside in museums, carefully restored, beautifully displayed, annotated with whatever information archaeology has been able to extract, but they remain essentially mute, witnesses to a vision we cannot share, ambassadors from a culture whose inner life has been lost beyond recovery. Standing before them, one feels not merely the distance of 3,000 years, but a distance of understanding, a gap between their world and ours that no amount of scholarship can fully bridge. What did they believe? What did they fear? What moved them to cast these images and then to destroy them? The bronze faces do not answer. They simply stare, with those impossible eyes, into a present they never imagined and a future they did not survive to see. The questions trail behind us as we move now, leaving the Sichuan Basin and those impossible bronze faces, travelling eastward and then northward across landscapes that shift from subtropical abundance to something drier, older, marked by the yellow earth that gives this region its character. The Yangtze's domain recedes behind us as we enter the drainage of another great river, the system that would become the cradle of what later dynasties called Chinese civilization proper, the Yellow River and its tributaries, cutting through lowest plateaus that accumulated grain by grain over hundreds of thousands of years, wind-blown silt from the deserts of Central Asia, settling into deposits dozens of meters deep, carving easily, eroding into fantastic shapes, burying whatever lay beneath it and whatever would later be built upon it. Here, in this landscape of yellow dust and harsh winters, in a terrain that seems inhospitable compared to the lush valleys of the south, Another culture left its mark, a culture whose scale and sophistication were only recognized in the 21st century, whose very existence challenges comfortable narratives about the gradual development of Chinese urban civilization. Shimao, the name itself is modest, borrowed from a village in Shanxi province, a collection of modern dwellings perched unknowingly above what would prove to be one of the largest fortified settlements of the ancient world. For centuries, perhaps millennia, farmers had worked these fields, herded sheep across these ridges, built their homes from the abundant yellow earth, never suspecting what lay beneath them or what the eroded features of the landscape actually represented. The Loess had been kind to Shimao, burying it gently, preserving its stones beneath a blanket of accumulated dust, hiding it so completely that even when portions of its walls protruded above the surface, they were mistaken for natural formations or dismissed as relatively recent constructions of no particular interest. It was not until 1976 that archaeologists began to suspect something unusual about this site, and not until excavations intensified in the early 21st century that the true scale of Shimao began to emerge. A revelation that would reshape understanding of early Chinese urbanism and push back the timeline for sophisticated fortification technology by centuries. What they found was not a village. It was not even a town. It was a city, a stone city of approximately 400 hectares, making it one of the largest urban centres anywhere in the world during its period of occupation. 400 hectares. To grasp this figure requires comparison. The inner city of ancient Ur in Mesopotamia, one of the great urban achievements of the Bronze Age, covered approximately 60 hectares. The celebrated site of Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley, that marvel of urban planning, occupied roughly 250 hectares at its maximum extent. Shimao dwarfed them both, sprawling across ridgetops and valleys in northern Shanxi, its walls snaking along the contours of the terrain in a defensive configuration that demonstrated both engineering sophistication and strategic awareness of an order previously unexpected in this era and region. And the date? Radiocarbon analysis placed the initial construction of Shimao at approximately 2300 BCE, with continued occupation and expansion lasting until roughly 1800 BCE. 500 years of urban life, 500 years of construction and modification, 500 years of a complex society functioning at a level that Chinese historical tradition had reserved for the Shang dynasty, which would not emerge for another several centuries. Shimao was already ancient when the Shang oracle bones were first inscribed. Its walls had already begun to crumble when Chinese written history commenced its recording. An entire urban civilization had risen, flourished, and declined in this northern frontier zone, leaving no trace in the historical memory of the cultures that followed. The walls themselves defy easy explanation. Not earthen ramparts of the kind that later Chinese cultures would favour, nor the brick constructions that characterised other early civilizations, but stone, massive stone walls constructed from locally quarried material, rising in some places to heights exceeding 8 metres, incorporating bastions and gates and defensive features of remarkable complexity. The construction technique involved an outer facing of carefully shaped stones, an inner core of rubble and earth, and a systematic approach to buttressing and reinforcement that demonstrated clear understanding of structural engineering principles. Walking the remnants of these walls, one cannot help but notice the deliberation evident in every choice. The selection of foundation sites, the angling of approaches, the placement of towers at intervals calculated to provide overlapping fields of observation. This was not fortification by accident or accumulated tradition. This was fortification by design, by intention, by minds that understood siege warfare and defensive strategy at a level of sophistication that conventional timelines did not anticipate. Yet what makes Shimao genuinely disturbing, what transforms it from an impressive archaeological site into an unsettling enigma, is not merely its scale or its defensive sophistication. It is what the excavations have revealed within those massive walls, the evidence of practices that sit uneasily alongside any narrative of gradual civilizational progress. Human skulls, dozens of them, discovered embedded within the walls themselves, placed in foundation deposits and at gateway constructions, positioned with evident deliberation in patterns that suggest ritual significance rather than casual discard. Young women, predominantly, their skulls showing marks consistent with violent death, their remains incorporated into the very fabric of the fortifications they would serve to protect, guard, or empower through whatever spiritual mechanism the builders believed in. The conventional interpretation speaks of foundation sacrifices, a practice documented in many ancient cultures worldwide, the offering of life to sanctify construction, to bind spirits to the protection of walls, to seal whatever covenant the builders had made with whatever powers they served. The Shang dynasty, centuries later, would practice human sacrifice on a grand scale, with hundreds of victims accompanying royal burials. Perhaps Shimao represents an earlier manifestation of similar beliefs, a precedent for practices that would continue in modified form throughout Chinese antiquity. Perhaps the skulls embedded in these walls represent a tradition stretching back even further, into periods for which we have no archaeological record, into the darkness of pre-literate antiquity when such offerings may have been common across many cultures. But knowing that foundation sacrifices occurred elsewhere does not diminish the impact of encountering them here, in this context, at this scale. Each skull represents a person, a young woman who lived approximately 4,300 years ago, who had a name and a family and a life that ended in violence so that her remains could become part of a wall. What did she know of the purpose she was to serve? Did she understand the cosmology that marked her for this fate? Or was she seized from some conquered population, a victim of war rather than a willing participant in ritual? The stones do not answer. They hold her bones in silence, as they have for more than 4 millennia, preserving the evidence of a practice we can document but not fully comprehend. More than skulls emerged from the excavations at Shimao. The site yielded jade, significant quantities of jade artifacts including jade inlays that once decorated the walls themselves, gleaming green against the grey stone, marking gateways and significant structures with the material that would remain precious throughout Chinese history. The presence of jade at Shimao connects this northern fortress city to trade networks extending far to the south and east, to the sources of nephrite in the Kunlun Mountains and beyond, to the cultures of the Yangtze Delta that we will soon visit. Jade does not occur locally in Shanxi. Every piece found at Shimao represents acquisition from distant sources, transport across hundreds of kilometers, integration into a symbolic system that valued this particular stone above all others. The early Chinese reverence for jade, documented extensively in later texts and archaeological contexts, was already fully developed at Shimao, already embedded in whatever ideology governed this massive settlement. What was Shimao? The question seems simple but resists simple answers. It was clearly a centre of power, a seat of authority capable of mobilising the labour necessary to construct and maintain 400 hectares of fortified urban space. It was clearly a ritual centre, as evidenced by the sacrificial remains and the jade adornments and the deliberate destruction of certain structures at specific moments in its history. It was clearly a manufacturing centre, with evidence of jade working, bone working, bronze working and other craft production occurring within its walls. But was it a capital of a territorial state, commanding allegiance from surrounding settlements? Was it a ceremonial centre, a place of pilgrimage and ritual rather than permanent residence for a large population? Was it a refuge, a defensive stronghold designed to protect a population from external threats? The evidence supports multiple interpretations without definitively confirming any single one. The defensive features suggest genuine concern about military threats, about enemies capable of mounting sustained attacks against fortified positions. Against whom were these walls built? The lowest plateau of northern Shanxi was, in this period, a borderland between agricultural societies to the south and pastoral societies to the north, a zone of contact and competition between ways of life that would remain in tension throughout Chinese history. Perhaps Shimao represents an early chapter in the long struggle between the settled and the nomadic, between the agricultural and the pastoral, between the great wall builders and those against whom great walls were built. The massive fortifications would make sense in such a context. Not paranoid overbuilding, but realistic response to genuine threat. But the elaboration of these defences, the sophistication of their design, the resources invested in their construction, all of this suggests something more than mere protection. These walls were not purely functional. They were symbolic, statements of power and permanence meant to impress and intimidate, meant to declare to all who approached that here resided authority of a significant order. The placement of sacrificial remains, the embedding of jade ornaments, the careful orientation of gateways. Every element spoke of ideology, of cosmological concerns, of beliefs about the relationship between the living and the dead, between the human and the divine, between the fortress and the forces it was meant to contain or channel or invoke. One particular structure at Shimao has drawn especially intense attention, a stepped pyramid at the heart of the palatial district, rising in tiers above the surrounding buildings, covering an area of approximately 24 hectares and reaching heights estimated at over 70 meters before the erosion of centuries reduced it to its current state. A pyramid in northern China, dating to more than 2,000 years before the Common Era. The form immediately evokes comparisons to the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, to the temple platforms of Mesoamerica, to the pyramidal structures of ancient Egypt. Yet these comparisons also highlight the isolation of Shimao. There is no evidence of contact between Shimao and these distant centres, no thread of transmission that might explain the shared architectural vocabulary. The stepped pyramid form, it seems, emerged independently in multiple cultures across the globe, a convergent evolution toward a shape that serves ritual and symbolic purposes in ways that different peoples, separated by oceans and continents, somehow arrived at through their own cultural development. What happened atop this pyramid? The excavations have revealed traces of extensive mural paintings, rare survivals of pigment on plaster that once covered the interior walls of structures at the summit, geometric patterns, symbolic designs, possibly representational images whose details have been lost to time. These fragmentary remains hint at a visual culture of considerable sophistication, an aesthetic tradition that expressed whatever beliefs or narratives governed life at Shimao. Combined with the jade artifacts, the bronze objects, the evidence of ritual activity and human sacrifice, the murals suggest a society with a complex religious system, a developed iconography, a coherent worldview that united the living and the dead, the natural and the supernatural, the practical concerns of defense and subsistence, with the spiritual concerns of meaning and transcendence. And then Shimao fell. Around 1800 BCE, the great stone city was abandoned, its population dispersing, its walls beginning the long process of erosion and burial that would eventually hide it from memory and history alike. The pattern recalls Sanxingdui, a complex culture arising, flourishing, achieving remarkable heights of artistic and architectural expression, and then vanishing without clear explanation, without successors, without descendants who preserved its memory in recoverable form. What drove the Shimao people to abandon their massive fortifications? Climate change has been proposed. The period around 1800 BCE saw significant shifts in rainfall patterns across northern China, potentially undermining the agricultural base that supported urban life. Warfare has been suggested. Perhaps the very enemies against whom those walls were built finally proved victorious, or perhaps internal conflict tore the society apart. Disease, environmental degradation, social collapse, religious transformation. The usual suspects parade before us. None of them entirely convincing, all of them partial at best. What we know is that after 1800 BCE, the Les Plateau entered a different phase of cultural development, one that eventually connected to the traditions recognizable in later Chinese history, one that retained no memory of the great stone city that had once dominated this region. The people who built Shimao, who sacrificed young women in their foundations, who adorned their walls with jade and painted murals in their summit temples, these people passed into oblivion, their achievements buried beneath the patient accumulation of yellow dust, their existence unsuspected until modern archaeology began peeling back the layers of time. Standing amid the ruins of Shimao today, one feels the weight of 4 millennia pressing down, the accumulated silence of centuries during which these walls went unrecognized, unremembered, unknown. The Laos landscape stretches in every direction, eroded into fantastic shapes by wind and water, sculpted by the same forces that buried and preserved this ancient city. The stone walls, partially excavated, rise from the yellow earth like the bones of some enormous creature, fragments of a skeleton whose full form can only be imagined. How many other sites lie hidden beneath this landscape? How many other cities and temples and fortresses await discovery in the endless deposits of wind-blown silt? The archaeological work at Shimao has only scratched the surface of what this region might contain, what secrets the Laos Plateau still guards beneath its seemingly barren exterior. The questions multiply rather than diminish as excavation continues, as each discovery raises new puzzles even while addressing old ones. The Shimao culture did not develop in isolation. Other sites from the same general period have been identified across northern China, showing connections and similarities that suggest networks of interaction, shared traditions of construction and ritual, a broader cultural complex of which Shimao represented merely the largest and most elaborate manifestation. But these connections only deepen the mystery. Where did this tradition originate? How did it spread? What common ancestry or common influence produced the shared features visible across these disparate sites? The conventional narratives of Chinese civilization, focused on the Yellow River Valley and the emergence of the Shang, have no place for Shimao, no framework within which to situate its massive walls and human sacrifices and stepped pyramid. Shimao challenges these narratives simply by existing, by demonstrating that complex urban civilization in this region developed earlier and in different patterns than the traditional accounts would suggest. Our journey must press onward now, leaving the Yellow Loess and its buried secrets, turning eastward toward a different landscape, a different set of enigmas. From the highlands of Shanxi, we descend toward the coastal plains, toward a region where water dominates rather than earth, where rivers and lakes and marshes shaped human settlement into patterns unlike those of the dry northwest. We are approaching the Yangtze Delta, that vast alluvial fan where one of Asia's mightiest rivers spreads into a maze of waterways before finally reaching the sea. Here, in what is now Zhejiang province, flourished another culture whose sophistication continues to astonish: Liangzhu, the Jade Kingdom of the East, builder of the earliest known hydraulic engineering complex anywhere in the world. The name belongs to a village, as so many of these archaeological designations do: Liangzhu Town, an unremarkable settlement in the modern suburbs of Hangzhou, one of China's most prosperous cities. Beneath this ordinary surface, extending across more than 300 square kilometers of now urbanized landscape, lie the remains of something extraordinary. A planned city, a network of canals and reservoirs, a complex of ceremonial sites and workshops and residential areas that operated for more than 1,000 years before abandoning its achievements to the rising waters and accumulating sediments of the delta. Liangzhu. The word carries no inherent meaning to most ears, yet what it represents deserves to stand alongside any of the great early civilizations that conventional history celebrates. The culture now identified with this site flourished between approximately 3,300 BCE and 2,300 BCE. 1,000 years of continuous development, a millennium during which the Liangzhu people transformed their watery environment into something ordered, productive, and symbolically charged. These dates place Liangzhu firmly in the Neolithic period by conventional classification, before the advent of bronze technology that defines the Bronze Age, before the writing systems that enable history properly understood. Yet the achievements of Liangzhu rival or exceed those of societies that developed bronze and writing centuries or millennia later. How do we reconcile this? How do we fit a Stone Age culture into conceptual frameworks that associate such achievements with technological phases that Liangzhu never reached? The jade artifacts provide the most immediate answer to why Liangzhu matters, why this culture commands attention despite its position in an era conventionally dismissed as primitive. Liangzhu jade is among the finest ever produced anywhere in the world, worked with a precision and aesthetic refinement that leave modern observers struggling to comprehend how it was achieved with the tools available. The signature forms are distinctive: the Kong, a squared tube with a circular interior bore, and the Bai, a flat disc with a central perforation. These shapes would remain sacred throughout Chinese history, preserved in ritual context for thousands of years after Liangzhu itself vanished, passed down through cultural transformations that remembered the forms even when the original meanings were forgotten. What did these objects represent to the people who made them? The Kong, with its combination of square and circular elements, has been interpreted as a symbol uniting earth and sky, the angular and the curved, the bounded and the infinite. The Bai, with its perfect circularity and its empty centre, evokes heaven itself, the dome of the sky with a pole star at its heart around which all creation revolves. These interpretations remain speculation, of course, educated guesses projected backward across 5,000 years of silence. The Liangzhu left no writing, no inscriptions, no texts that might illuminate what they believed or how they understood the cosmos they inhabited. Their jade speaks, but in a language we cannot fully translate, a vocabulary of form and material whose grammar eludes our reconstructions. Yet the objects themselves testify to something beyond mere decoration, beyond simple status display. The labour invested in a single large Kong, hundreds of hours of patient grinding, polishing, drilling with tools of bamboo and sand and water, speaks of value systems in which time itself became a sacred offering, in which the slow transformation of stone into symbol carried meanings we can sense but never fully articulate. The technical achievements embedded in these jades continue to puzzle specialists who have devoted careers to understanding them. Nephrite jade, the material the Liangzhu favoured, ranks among the toughest substances known, harder than steel in some respects, resistant to fracture, demanding of any tool that attempts to shape it. Modern sculptors working with jade employ diamond-tipped implements, powered machinery, precision instruments calibrated to tolerances measured in fractions of millimetres. The Liangzhu possessed none of these advantages. Their toolkit consisted of organic materials, bamboo drills, possibly stone points, abrasive sands of varying coarseness, water as lubricant and coolant, and above all, time measured not in hours but in months and years of patient repetitive labour. Yet the results they achieved equal or surpass anything produced with modern technology. The walls of Liangzhu Kong display relief carvings of extraordinary intricacy, stylised faces with bulging eyes, elaborate headdresses composed of feathers or rays, bodies that seem to transform into animal forms, geometric patterns whose regularity suggests some form of measurement or template now lost. How were these designs transferred to the jade surface with such consistency? How were the relief depths maintained across large areas without the variations one would expect from hand-guided tools? How were the interior bores of the Kong drilled so perfectly cylindrical through lengths of up to 30 centimetres of solid stone? Conventional explanations invoke skill, patience, and specialised craft traditions passed down through generations of master artisans. These answers are not wrong, but they feel incomplete, insufficient to account for the sheer improbability of what was achieved. Standing before a display of Liangzhu jade in any of the world's great museums, one cannot help but sense that something is missing from our understanding, some technique or tool or approach that made possible what ought to have been impossible. The jade bee reached diameters approaching 30 centimetres in the largest examples, yet maintain near-perfect circularity across their entire extent. The central perforations align precisely perpendicular to the disc surface. The thickness remains uniform with intolerances that challenge measurement. The polish achieves a reflective quality that seems to gather and concentrate light. Were these objects made on some form of rotating apparatus? A primitive lathe that allowed centrifugal precision to replace the unsteadiness of human hands? No such device has been found in Liangzhu contexts. No evidence suggests its existence, yet the products themselves argue for something beyond freehand shaping guided only by eye and touch. More mysterious still is the question of where the jade itself originated. Nephrite deposits exist in China, but the nearest significant sources lie hundreds of kilometres from the Liangzhu heartland in the Yangtze Delta. Analysis of Liangzhu jade suggests materials from multiple origins, some perhaps local from now depleted deposits, others from distances that imply organised trade networks spanning vast territories. How did a Neolithic culture, lacking wheeled vehicles, lacking pack animals larger than dogs, transport tons of heavy stone across such distances? What motivated this enormous investment of effort, this commitment of human labour to moving rock from mountain to delta? The jade trade hints at something larger, networks of exchange, communication, shared symbolism that connected Liangzhu to distant communities. When artifacts bearing characteristic Liangzhu styles appear at sites hundreds of kilometres away, they testify to relationships we can only dimly perceive, connections that transcended the boundaries of individual settlements, possibly extending into what are now entirely different cultural regions. Did Liangzhu jade carry religious significance recognised across this broader world? Were the forms and patterns it displayed understood by peoples who had never visited the delta but somehow shared in its cosmological vocabulary? Yet the jade, for all its magnificence, represents only one dimension of Liangzhu achievement. The hydraulic engineering complex that supported this culture remains even more astonishing, a transformation of landscape on a scale that would not be matched in China for another 2,000 years. The Liangzhu did not simply adapt to their watery environment. They reshaped it fundamentally, constructed it according to plans that required surveying, coordinated labour, sustained management across generations. The system centred on a series of dams, massive earthen structures stretching across valleys in the hills to the northwest of the main city. These dams impounded reservoirs holding an estimated 43 million cubic meters of water, created artificial lakes that served as buffers against both drought and flood, regulated the flow of water through the lowland canal network that connected the various components of the Liangzhu urban complex. The engineering principles embodied in these structures would not be formally articulated for millennia, yet they function according to those principles nonetheless: gradient management, overflow channels, retention basins, controlled release. How did a Neolithic society, lacking the mathematical frameworks that would later formalize hydraulic engineering, design and construct a system of such sophistication? Trial and error offers one explanation: generations of observation, incremental improvement, accumulated practical wisdom encoded in tradition rather than theory. This explanation satisfies logic but strains imagination. The margin for error in dam construction is narrow. Failure can be catastrophic, destroying in minutes what required years to build. The Liangzhu system shows no evidence of such failures, no signs of the experimentation and correction one might expect from a purely empirical approach. The dams themselves were constructed using a technique the Chinese call Kao Guo Gong, a method involving layers of grass and sediment that create structural integrity through organic binding. The grass decomposes slowly, leaving voids that allow drainage while the surrounding earth compacts into a stable mass. This technique appears to have been deliberately chosen and consistently applied across the entire dam system, suggesting not improvisation, but established engineering doctrine, a body of technical knowledge maintained and transmitted within the Liangzhu community. The labour requirements stagger calculation. Modern estimates suggest that the dam system alone required hundreds of thousands of person-days of coordinated work, excavation, transportation, placement, compaction, repeated through seasons and years until the structures reached their final form. This labour force had to be fed, organised, directed, motivated. It had to be drawn from populations whose primary concern was presumably subsistence, the endless cycle of planting and harvesting that keeps any agricultural society alive. How did Liangzhu generate the surplus necessary to support such projects? How were workers recruited, assigned, supervised? What authority commanded such obedience, and what ideology justified such collective sacrifice? The answers must lie somewhere in the jade, in the rituals for which those exquisite objects were created, in the cosmological beliefs that invested landscape with sacred meaning. The hydraulic works were not merely practical infrastructure, though they served practical purposes admirably. They were also statements of cosmic order imposed upon the chaos of nature, transformations that aligned the physical world with whatever metaphysical template the Liangzhu believed in. The labour was not merely economic activity but religious offering, participation in a sacred project that elevated ordinary work to spiritual significance. The city itself extends across multiple zones, whose functions can be partially reconstructed from archaeological evidence. A central palace area, surrounded by walls, contained structures that appear to have served administrative or ceremonial purposes. Surrounding districts housed craft workshops where the jade was worked, where other prestigious goods were manufactured under what appears to have been some form of centralized oversight. Residential areas spread outward in patterns suggesting social stratification, proximity to the center correlating with status, with access to luxury goods, with elaborate burial treatment. The waterways that thread through this landscape served as arteries of communication and transport, connecting the various zones into a functioning urban organism. When the rains came in summer, when the Yangtze swelled with monsoon waters, the whole system responded. The highland reservoirs absorbed excess flow, the dams regulated release, the canals directed water where it was needed and drained it from where it was not. The city floated, in a sense, suspended above the wetland it had conquered, maintained by constant vigilance and continuous labour. This was not merely settlement but terraforming, the creation of an artificial landscape that depended for its existence on the sustained application of human intelligence and effort. The burials tell their own stories of social complexity. Liangzhu cemeteries reveal stark differentiations. Some individuals interred with hundreds of jade objects, others with mere handfuls, still others with none at all. The largest tombs contain bai and kong by the dozens, axes of polished jade that never knew practical use, beads and pendants and ornaments of staggering quantity and quality. These accumulations represent lifetimes of craft labour, the concentrated product of specialised workshops serving elite patrons who could command such production. What social mechanisms allowed such concentration of wealth? What beliefs legitimised inequalities that seem, by these burial measures, to have been extreme? The jade itself provides clues, the symbolism of heaven and earth, the imagery of transformation and power, the masks that stare from Kong surfaces with expressions suggesting authority both human and superhuman. Those who controlled jade controlled access to the sacred, mediated between ordinary communities and cosmic forces, derived their power from roles that were simultaneously political and religious. Yet Liangzhu, for all its achievements, did not survive. Around 2300 BCE, the archaeological record transforms dramatically. The city emptied, the waterworks failed, the jade workshops ceased production. Within a few generations, the sophisticated culture that had flourished for a millennium faded into the landscapes it had so carefully constructed. Later peoples would inhabit these territories, would farm the fields the Liangzhu had created, would occasionally encounter jade objects that would seem to them impossibly ancient and sacred. But the knowledge died. The techniques, the beliefs, the organisational capacities that had made Liangzhu possible. Climate change offers the prevailing explanation. Around 2300 BCE, monsoon patterns shifted across East Asia, bringing increased rainfall to the Yangtze Delta region. The carefully calibrated hydraulic system, designed for the climate regime of previous centuries, could not adapt quickly enough to the new conditions. Floods overwhelmed the dams, silt choked the canals, the waterlogged landscape that had been an asset became a liability, the agricultural base collapsed, the surplus that supported craft production and elite authority vanished, the population dispersed into smaller, simpler settlements that archaeology can barely trace. This explanation satisfies without fully convincing. Climate change is real, its effects on ancient societies demonstrable, yet civilizations have survived comparable challenges elsewhere. Why did Liangzhu collapse so completely, so irrecoverably? Why did the knowledge embedded in its achievements vanish rather than migrating with displaced populations, finding new applications in new contexts? The dam-building techniques, the jade-working skills, the social organization capable of coordinating such complex projects, these represented accumulated wisdom of enormous value. Where did it go? Perhaps the very integration of Liangzhu culture worked against its survival. A system in which practical infrastructure, religious belief and social hierarchy were so tightly interwoven might have been unable to decompose gracefully, unable to preserve some elements while abandoning others. When the physical system failed, perhaps the ideological system that justified it failed simultaneously, leaving populations not merely displaced but disoriented, cut off from the frameworks of meaning that had organized their lives. The jade might have seemed not merely valueless but cursed, associated with powers that had proven false, with protections that had failed when needed most. The echoes persisted nonetheless, transmitted through channels we cannot trace. When later Chinese dynasties elevated Bayan Kong to supreme ritual status, when these forms appeared in contexts utterly different from their Liangzhu origins, something of the ancient meaning survived, transformed beyond recognition, yet somehow continuous. The shapes remembered what the words had forgotten, carried forward associations of cosmic significance that transcended the particular culture that had created them. Liangzhu died, but its symbolic vocabulary proved immortal, absorbed into traditions that would know nothing of its source, yet would preserve its essential forms across 5,000 years of history. Standing at the edge of Liangzhu, the edge of knowledge as much as geography, one confronts the fundamental strangeness of the deep past. Here was a civilization that achieved things we struggle to explain, that operated according to principles we cannot fully recover, that vanished leaving only its most durable products as testimony. The jade survives because jade is nearly indestructible. The meanings survive in fragments, in forms whose significance we guess at rather than know. The people themselves are gone utterly, their languages silent, their names forgotten, their individual lives absorbed into anonymity that no archaeology can pierce. Our journey continues, carrying the weight of these mysteries, these reminders of how much has been lost and how little we truly understand. Eastward the path leads still, into territories where different questions arise from different evidence, where the conversation between past and present takes different forms. But the questions themselves remain constant. How did they achieve what they achieved? What did they believe? What happened to them? Questions that every site along this path poses in its own particular voice. Questions that accumulate without resolving, that multiply with each new encounter. The waters close over Liangzhu as they closed over so much else, as rising seas and changing climates have claimed the evidence we will never recover. What remains is what stone could preserve. The jade that resisted time, the earthworks that compressed rather than dissolved, the traces that patient excavation continues to reveal. Each new discovery extends the story without completing it, adds details to a picture whose outlines remain uncertain. Liangzhu was extraordinary, this much is clear. What made it possible? What made it vanish? What it teaches about the capacities of ancient humanity? These questions remain suspended in the ambiguity that defines our relationship with everything that came before writing, before records, before history in the conventional sense. The next mystery rises from entirely different ground, carved from living rock rather than built upon alluvial sediment. From water, we turn to stone, from the open delta to enclosed darkness, from surfaces exposed to sky to chambers buried beyond the reach of light. The Liangzhu caves await, one of the strangest discoveries in all of Chinese archaeology, a puzzle that defies categorization, that challenges every assumption about what Neolithic communities could or would accomplish. We travel southward now, into Zhejiang's interior, into a landscape of low hills and temperate valleys, where rice paddies today cover ground that has been farmed for millennia. The town of Liangzhu occupies no special prominence, appears on no tourist itineraries save those specifically devoted to its one remarkable feature. In 1992, a local farmer attempting to drain a pond in search of a supposed underground water source instead discovered the entrance to something far more extraordinary, a network of artificial caverns carved entirely by hand from the surrounding sandstone, spaces of such scale and sophistication that their very existence seems impossible. The first cave opened revealed a chamber nearly 30 meters long, over 20 meters wide, rising to heights exceeding 18 meters at its apex. The ceiling arches in graceful curves that follow the natural inclinations of structural engineering, that distribute weight and resist collapse according to principles that required either mathematical understanding or practical wisdom accumulated across generations. Pillars support this ceiling at intervals, pillars carved from the living rock as the chamber was excavated downward, left standing as the surrounding stone was removed, their placement and proportions suggesting calculation rather than accident. But it was not one cave. As exploration continued, as more ponds were drained and more entrances identified, the complex expanded to include more than 30 individual caverns, their total excavated volume exceeding 30,000 cubic meters of stone. 30,000 cubic meters! The figure resists comprehension, demands translation into more intuitive terms. Imagine a cube of solid rock 60 meters on each side, then imagine removing it entirely by hand, with iron chisels and patience, carrying each fragment to the surface through passages that constrain movement, working by the light of oil lamps in chambers where oxygen grows scarce and the darkness is absolute. The scale alone challenges explanation. The technical precision compounds the mystery. The walls of the Liangzhu caves bear distinctive chisel marks, parallel striations covering every surface in patterns of remarkable consistency. These marks have been analysed, measured, categorized by researchers attempting to understand the tools and techniques employed. The grooves maintain uniform depth and spacing across walls, ceilings, pillars, each stroke apparently executed with consistent pressure and angle. No natural variation disrupts the patterns, no areas of hasty or careless work, no signatures of individual styles that might distinguish one worker from another. What purpose demanded such effort? The chambers contain no inscriptions, no paintings, no artifacts that might indicate their function. They were not tombs. No burials have been found. They were not temples. No altars. No cult objects. No evidence of ritual activity. They were not quarries in the conventional sense. The stone removed was sandstone of no particular value, not prized for construction or sculpture, not worth the effort of extraction for its own sake. They were not storage facilities. No evidence of goods ever occupying these spaces, no residues or traces of materials that might have been kept here. They exist, enormous and enigmatic, and we do not know why. The emptiness itself becomes the puzzle, the silence of these chambers a kind of testimony we cannot read. Conventional archaeology offers categories: temple, tomb, storehouse, quarry, and the Liangzhu caves refuse them all, standing outside the taxonomies we use to make sense of the ancient world. Some researchers have suggested they might have served as underground refuges, places of shelter during conflict or catastrophe. Yet the scale seems excessive for any defensive purpose, the effort disproportionate to any conceivable threat. Others propose they might have been created as reserves against flood, spaces where people and provisions could wait out the periodic inundations that characterize this region's hydrology. But again, the mathematics resist this interpretation. The labor required to carve such chambers could have built embankments, terraces, elevated settlements, any of a dozen more efficient solutions to the problem of rising water. The dating compounds every question. Organic materials found in sediment at the cave floors have yielded radiocarbon ages placing initial excavation before 2,000 years ago, possibly significantly earlier, pushing the origin of these chambers back into a period when central authority in this region remained fragmented, when no dynasty controlled sufficient labor or commanded sufficient resources to undertake works of this magnitude. The Han Dynasty, which governed China during the period these dates suggest, certainly possessed the organizational capacity for monumental construction, built walls and palaces and tombs of staggering ambition, yet no record exists of the Liangzhu caves in any Han document. No mention of their excavation, their purpose, their very existence. They appear in no census of public works, no administrative report, no traveller's account, no local chronicle. A project requiring decades of sustained effort, employing thousands of workers, removing tens of thousands of cubic meters of stone, and the contemporary record contains not a single reference to it. How does something this large become invisible to history? The question haunts every interpretation, suggests either that the caves are far older than the radiocarbon dates indicate, predating the literate civilization that might have recorded them, or that their creation was somehow hidden, deliberate secrecy surrounding a project whose purpose demanded concealment. Both possibilities open onto further mysteries, further questions that multiply rather than resolve. If older, who built them? And how did Neolithic communities without metal tools, without writing, without the organizational structures we associate with monumental labor, accomplish what even later dynasties would have found challenging? If secret, what purpose could have justified such extraordinary concealment? What knowledge or activity required spaces of this scale hidden from official awareness? Standing at the entrance to one of these chambers, one feels the weight of the question in almost physical terms. The air grows cool as the passage descends, the temperature dropping as sunlight fades and the rock enfolds everything in its ancient embrace. Sound behaves strangely here. Voices carry in unexpected patterns. Footsteps echo and re-echo from surfaces designed according to principles we cannot fully recover. The chisel marks catch the beam of a flashlight, throw shadows that seem to move across the walls, create the illusion of motion in spaces that have remained utterly still for millennia. The sandstone itself takes on different colours as the light shifts, bands of ochre and rust and pale cream that record changes in the ancient environment, sediments laid down in lakes and rivers that existed long before humanity arrived in this region. The precision of the carved surfaces demands attention, refuses to let the eye pass without registering its strangeness. These are not rough excavations, not the irregular surfaces one might expect from practical mining or simple shelter making. Each wall presents a finished face, the chisel strokes applied with care that suggests intention beyond mere utility. The grooves run at angles of approximately 60 degrees, consistent across chambers that had to be carved independently, by different teams working without sight of each other's progress. What coordinated this consistency? What system of training or oversight ensured that workers in separate caverns maintained identical technique? The question implies organization, standardization, quality control, concepts we associate with industrial production rather than ancient craft. Some investigators have noted acoustic properties in certain chambers, resonances that amplify specific frequencies, that create standing waves at particular locations. Whether these properties were intentional or incidental remains impossible to determine. The physics of carved chambers will produce acoustic effects regardless of builder intent, and attributing sophisticated sound engineering to unknown ancient craftspeople risks the same projection of modern capabilities onto the past that haunts so much speculation about unexplained sites. Yet the consistency of the carving, the care taken with surfaces that would have been invisible in ordinary use, suggests that something beyond simple excavation guided the work. These chambers were not merely dug, they were shaped, finished, brought to completion according to standards that remain opaque to us. The geometric relationships between caves add another layer of complexity. Adjacent chambers share walls of precisely calibrated thickness, neither so thin as to risk collapse nor so thick as to waste labour in redundant carving. The architects, if we may call them that, understood load distribution, knew how to position support pillars to carry maximum weight with minimum mass, calculated angles and spans that approach optimal efficiency. This knowledge might have been empirical, accumulated through trial and error across generations of underground construction, yet no tradition of cave carving on this scale exists elsewhere in the region. No progression from simple excavations to complex chambers that might trace the learning curve of developing expertise. The Liangzhu caves appear without precedent, as if the techniques required for their creation arrived fully formed. Water management within the complex reveals further sophistication. Despite their depth, despite the porous nature of the surrounding sandstone, the caves remained largely dry across the centuries before their discovery. Drainage systems carved into floors directing groundwater toward collection points, channels that prevented accumulation and protected the chambers from the slow deterioration that moisture would cause. After discovery, when the pumps that initially drained the surface ponds were removed, water did begin to infiltrate, demonstrating that the original builders had solved a problem that modern abandonment recreated. They understood hydrology, anticipated the behaviour of water through fractured rock, designed interventions that remained effective for 2,000 years or more. The mystery deepens when we consider what is not there. No inscriptions mark these walls, no paintings illuminate their purpose, no artifacts littered the floors when they were first entered. The absence itself requires explanation. If these chambers served any religious function, where are the offerings? If they housed any community, where are the discarded tools, the broken pottery, the accumulated debris of human occupation? If they stored any goods, where are the residues, the stains, the evidence of what was kept? The chambers were either cleaned with extraordinary thoroughness at some point in their history, deliberately emptied of everything that might explain them, or they were never used in ways that would leave material traces. Both alternatives deepen rather than resolve the puzzle. We step back from the darkness, from the cool exhalation of these ancient voids, carrying questions that the caves themselves will not answer. Their presence in this landscape challenges every comfortable assumption about the relationship between effort and purpose, between scale and function, between what ancient peoples could accomplish and what they would choose to accomplish. Like the jade workshops of Liangzhu, like the megalithic walls of Shimao, like the bronze titans of Sanxingdui, the Liangzhu caves testify to capabilities and intentions that exceed our categories, that refuse the explanations we bring ready-made to the encounter. They stand, silent and enormous, monuments to something we cannot name. The journey through pre-dynastic China has taken us across landscapes of extraordinary diversity, from the alluvial plains of the Yellow River to the jade-rich deltas of the Yangtze, from loess plateaus crowned with stepped pyramids to temperate valleys harbouring carved caverns, from open sky to absolute darkness. Each site has offered its own enigmas, its own challenges to the narratives we construct about human antiquity. Yet patterns have emerged, correspondences that whisper of connections we cannot fully trace, that suggest communication or parallel development among cultures separated by geography, by time, by the vast distances that made contact difficult in an age before roads, before writing, before the unifying authority of imperial rule. The hydraulic sophistication appears everywhere. At Liangzhu, canals and reservoirs managing water across an entire delta system. At Shimao, drainage infrastructure protecting a city built on heights where water management should have been simple. In the Liangzhu caves, channels directing groundwater away from carved chambers. These are not coincidences of climate or geography. They represent shared understanding of hydrological principles, engineering solutions that required either direct transmission of knowledge or independent discovery of the same underlying truths. Water, it seems, taught the same lessons to communities across ancient China, and those communities proved remarkably apt students. The monumental impulse too connects these disparate sites. Shimao's walls, Liangzhu's platforms, the pyramids of Xi'an, the caverns of Longyu. Each represents investment of labour that exceeds any obvious practical necessity. Construction that must have been driven by purposes beyond the merely functional. Whether those purposes were religious, political, cosmological, or something else entirely, they generated works that have survived the millennia, that continue to astonish us with their scale and their mystery. The ancient inhabitants of this land built for permanence, created monuments that were meant to last, that were designed to outlast the communities that created them. What did they hope to communicate across the centuries? What message were they encoding in stone and jade and bronze, a message we receive but cannot read? The jade itself traces networks of connection that should not have existed. The nephrite of Liangzhu, the jade of Shimao, the worked stone found at sites scattered across thousands of kilometers, all point toward exchange systems of remarkable extent, trade routes or gift networks or ritual connections that linked communities who never knew each other's names into relationships of mutual dependence and shared meaning. The material moved, was transformed, acquired significance that attached to its travels as much as its inherent qualities. Jade from the mountains appeared on the coast, was worked by hands that had never seen the quarries from which it came, was buried with the dead who had never walked the paths along which it travelled. Bronze too connected what geography divided. The metallurgical traditions of Sanxingdui, whatever their ultimate origin, required materials that did not exist locally. Tin from distant sources, techniques perhaps transmitted from even farther away, designs that challenge every regional style we know. The bronze faces that gaze from the museum cases at Sanxingdui belong to a tradition we cannot trace, represent achievements we cannot explain, embody knowledge that arrived in the Sichuan basin through channels that remain invisible to archaeology. Someone knew how to cast these pieces, knew how to alloy the metals, knew how to conceive these faces that resemble nothing else in the ancient world. That knowledge came from somewhere, moved through space and time along routes we have not recovered. The astronomical orientations hint at shared cosmology, at ways of understanding sky and season that cross the boundaries between cultures. At Shimao, gates align to cardinal directions. Throughout the landscape of Xi'an, mounds positioned with reference to poles and solstices. At Liangzhu, platform orientations that may encode celestial observations. Whether these alignments reflect direct influence, inherited tradition, or independent response to the same celestial phenomena, they suggest minds attuned to the movements of stars and sun, to the rhythms of light that mark the passage of time. Before writing, before mathematics as we understand it, before instruments of precision, the ancient peoples of China looked upward and found meaning in what they saw. What have we learned, travelling through these landscapes of the forgotten? We have learned that history begins before history, that the first written records emerge from cultures already ancient, already sophisticated, already heir to millennia of development that left no textual trace. These Xia, if they existed, arose from this substrate of Neolithic complexity, inherited techniques and traditions accumulated across countless generations. The Shang, whose oracle bones provide our earliest substantial texts, did not invent Chinese civilization. They recorded a civilization that already existed, gave written voice to a culture that had been developing since the end of the last ice age and perhaps before. The roots reach far deeper than any text can touch. We have learned, too, that explanations must be held lightly, that confidence in interpretation is often premature. For the bygone pipes, we have theories but not certainty. Iron concretions, perhaps, but perhaps something stranger. For the pyramids of Xi'an, we have plausible identifications and persistent anomalies, burial mounds that seem straightforward, yet harbour questions that refuse resolution. For Sanxingdui, we have abundance of material and poverty of context, bronzes that astonish and texts that do not exist. For Liangzhu, we have engineering marvels and environmental catastrophe, a civilization that flourished and then vanished beneath the waters it had mastered. For Shimao, we have walls without warfare, skulls without invasion, a fortress that may never have needed to fight. For Longyu, we have excavation without purpose, labour without recorded reason, chambers that exist and nothing more. The mystery remains the product, as it must be. These sites do not yield their secrets to casual inquiry, do not surrender meaning to the first interpretation that presents itself. They require patience, humility, the willingness to sit with uncertainty rather than rush toward false resolution. What ancient peoples accomplished here defies easy explanation, not because those peoples were superhuman or assisted by forces beyond our understanding, but because they were human in ways we have forgotten, possessed knowledge we have lost, acted according to purposes we no longer share. The gap between their world and ours is not merely chronological, it is epistemic, existential, a difference in the very categories through which reality was organized and understood. The land remembers what documents do not. Stone preserves what paper cannot. The chisel marks in the Liangzhu caves, the jade Kong of Liangzhu, the bronze faces of Sanxingdui, the walls of Shimao, the mounds of Xi'an, the strange formations of Baigong, each speaks in a language we are only beginning to learn, offers testimony we are only beginning to hear. China before the dynasties was not a blank space waiting for civilization to begin. It was a world of extraordinary accomplishment, of sophisticated cultures building monuments we still do not understand, of peoples whose names we will never know, creating works that have outlasted everything we thought we knew about the past. The journey that began at Baigong Mountain, amid pipes that should not exist in rock that formed before humanity arrived, now approaches a different kind of pause. We have travelled through layers of time, descended through strata of mystery, encountered enigmas that compound rather than resolve. The questions multiply with each site, each artifact, each absence of explanation. Why did they build? What did they know? How did their knowledge vanish so completely that we must rediscover what they accomplished rather than inherit what they understood? These questions have no answers, or rather their answers lie buried beneath millennia of sediment, eroded by floods, scattered by conquest, lost to the same silences that swallowed the peoples who might have explained them. Yet the sites remain. The stones stand. The chambers wait in darkness for someone to illuminate their purpose. What was built here endures, even when understanding does not, even when context has vanished and meaning has faded to conjecture. Standing in these places, one feels the presence of the past as something more than memory, something almost physical, the weight of accumulated time pressing against the present, demanding recognition, refusing to be dismissed as merely historical. These are not dead places. They are places where the past continues, where ancient intentions still shape the landscape, where questions asked millennia ago remain unanswered, waiting. The story of pre-dynastic China is not complete. It cannot be complete because the evidence remains fragmentary, the interpretations provisional, the mysteries unresolved. What we have traced here is not a narrative with beginning, middle, and end, but a collection of glimpses, partial views of a world we see only through the gaps in our ignorance. More sites await discovery, more artifacts await interpretation, more questions await the formulation that will finally frame them clearly enough to answer. The ground beneath our feet holds secrets we have not yet learned to ask about, structures we have not yet found, meanings we have not yet imagined. And so we pause, not because the journey is finished, but because this portion of the path has reached a resting point, a moment to reflect on what has passed before continuing toward what lies ahead. The Liangzhu caves fade behind us, their darkness receding as we return to the surface, their silence lingering in memory as we prepare to turn our attention elsewhere. China's mysteries are inexhaustible, its past deeper than any inquiry can fully plumb, its secrets preserved in stone and bronze and jade, waiting with patience that makes human lifetimes seem like moments, waiting for understanding that may never come, waiting still. But waiting does not mean stillness. The earth itself continues to shift, to reveal, to confound those who study it with fresh impossibilities. And as the quiet of the Liangzhu caves settles into contemplation, another disturbance emerges from the deep archive of Chinese prehistory, not from a single site, but from the patterns that connect them, the threads that weave through separate mysteries to suggest a larger tapestry, whose full design remains beyond our grasp. Consider the problem of simultaneity. Across the landscape we have traversed, from the mineral-stained slopes of Baigong to the subterranean galleries of Liangzhu, a troubling observation presents itself. These sites do not arrange themselves neatly along a timeline of progressive development. The jade workshops of Liangzhu operated with precision that rivals later dynastic periods. The bronze casting of Sanxingdui achieved technical sophistication that appeared suddenly, fully formed, without the expected generations of experimental precursors. The walls of Shimao rose in an age when, according to conventional models, such fortifications should not yet have been necessary or possible. The pyramids near Xi'an accumulated earth into geometric forms that echo monuments separated by continents and millennia. The pipes of Baigong rest in stone that predates any acknowledged human presence. Each site, examined individually, presents anomalies sufficient to unsettle established narratives. Examined together, they suggest something more disturbing still, that the prehistory of this land followed paths we have not mapped, obeyed logics we have not recovered, produced achievements we cannot adequately explain. Mainstream archaeology attributes these phenomena to independent development, to parallel evolution of technologies and ideas, to the remarkable but ultimately comprehensible creativity of human communities solving similar problems in similar ways. The explanation has merit. Humans are pattern makers, problem solvers, builders whose ingenuity consistently exceeds expectation. Given sufficient time and pressure, cultures will develop sophisticated responses to their environments, will create beauty and meaning through whatever materials lie at hand, will organize societies capable of coordinating large-scale projects. The mainstream view does not require mysterious interventions or lost super-civilizations. It requires only that we credit ancient peoples with intelligence equal to our own, applied across spans of time we find difficult to imagine. Yet certain details resist this comfortable framing. The bronze alloys of Sanxingdui were not merely sophisticated, they were specific, consistent, suggesting standardized recipes maintained across production runs. Such consistency implies institutional memory, quality control, accumulated expertise passed through generations by mechanisms we cannot identify. Who trained the bronze workers? What schools preserved their knowledge? How did techniques remain stable enough to produce objects of uniform composition when the culture itself left no written records, no instructional texts, no evidence of the bureaucratic structures that typically maintain such standards? The bronze faces stare with expressions that seem almost to mock our confusion, their golden surfaces gleaming with secrets their makers chose not to inscribe in any medium that survives. The jade of Liangzhu presents similar puzzles. Nephrite jade is among the hardest materials worked in ancient China, requiring hours of patient abrasion to shape even small pieces. The Kong tubes and Bai discs produced by Liangzhu craftspeople number in the thousands, representing millions of labor hours invested in objects whose precise function remains debated. Were they astronomical instruments, ritual vessels, symbols of cosmic authority, status markers for an elite whose wealth was measured in the patience required to transform raw stone into geometric perfection? All explanations have been proposed, none has achieved consensus, and the objects themselves offer no testimony beyond their existence. They are here, they were made, the people who made them considered the investment worthwhile. Beyond these facts, interpretation becomes speculation, and speculation multiplies without resolution. What connects jade workers grinding nephrite along the Yangtze Delta with bronze casters pouring molten metal in Sichuan's mountains? What links the pyramid builders of the Wei River Valley with the cave excavators of Zhejiang? What thread runs through Shimao's fortress walls, through Baigong's impossible pipes, through sites we have visited and sites that remain buried, unknown, awaiting the accident or persistence that will bring them to light? The question assumes a connection exists, and perhaps that assumption itself requires examination. Perhaps these mysteries share nothing but their mysteriousness, their refusal to fit comfortably within narratives designed for different purposes. Perhaps the pattern we sense is imposed rather than discovered, a product of our desire for coherence rather than evidence of ancient unity. But consider the alternative, a landscape seething with independent creativity, multiple cultures across thousands of years developing sophisticated technologies, constructing massive monuments, organizing complex societies, and doing so in isolation, without influence or connection, each breakthrough achieved independently, each mystery generated by separate causes, requiring separate explanations. Such a scenario is not impossible. It is merely improbable, requiring us to believe that coincidence accounts for similarities, that parallel development explains convergences, that the patterns we perceive are artifacts of our perception, rather than traces of real relationships. The truth likely lies somewhere between these extremes. Neither a single unified civilization spanning prehistoric China, nor a collection of entirely independent cultures developing in isolation. Trade routes existed, ideas travelled, technologies spread through mechanisms we can only partially reconstruct. The jade of Liangzhu found its way to sites hundreds of kilometres distant, evidence of exchange networks that moved valuable materials across significant distances. Bronze technology may have entered China from the west, though the specific forms it took at Sanxingdui seem to have developed locally. The architectural principles visible at Shimao show awareness of fortification concepts that appear elsewhere in the ancient world. Influences flowed, adapted, transformed. What emerged was not a single culture but a constellation of related developments, a network of innovations whose full extent remains unmapped. Yet even this more nuanced picture leaves questions unanswered. Grant that trade and contact spread technologies and ideas, the question of origin remains. Where did the knowledge originate? Who first discovered that certain copper ores, combined with tin in specific proportions, produce bronze superior to either metal alone? Who first recognized that jade, despite its hardness, could be worked into forms of lasting beauty? Who first understood that pyramidal mounds could focus ritual power, that underground chambers could preserve what surface structures cannot, that walls thick enough could hold back forces both human and supernatural? These discoveries required someone to make them first, some mind or community to perceive possibilities and realize them in material form. The first bronze caster, the first jade carver, the first pyramid builder. Each stands at the head of a tradition, initiating a chain of transmission that stretches forward through centuries. Where are they? When did they live? What inspired them to attempt what no one before had attempted? The documents are silent because the documents do not reach back far enough. By the time writing appeared in China, these traditions were already ancient, their origins already lost to memory, their founders already legendary if they were remembered at all. The Yellow Emperor, the Three Sovereigns, the culture heroes of Chinese mythology. Do these figures preserve distorted memories of real individuals, innovators whose actual achievements became inflated through centuries of oral transmission until they acquired divine attributes and cosmic significance? Or are they purely mythological, invented to explain origins that were already inexplicable, to provide stories for peoples who had forgotten their own beginnings? The myths themselves offer no clear answer, their symbolic language more concerned with meaning than with historical accuracy, their purposes more religious than documentary. And so we return to the evidence that does survive: the bronze, the jade, the stone, the earth shaped by hands we cannot identify for purposes we cannot fully recover. These materials do not lie, though they may mislead. They preserve traces of actions, records of decisions, evidence of choices made by people who could not have imagined that millennia later their works would be scrutinized by descendants who share their genes but not their understanding. The chisel marks in the Liangzhu caves record the angle of tools held by hands long since dust. The bronze faces of Sanxingdui preserve the aesthetic sensibilities of artists whose names have vanished. The jade Kong of Liangzhu embody the spiritual convictions of communities whose beliefs we reconstruct only approximately. Each artifact is a message, but a message in a language whose grammar we are still learning, whose vocabulary we acquire word by word through painstaking inference. Some messages we may never decode. The Beigong pipes remain stubbornly resistant to explanation, their presence in ancient rock an anomaly that neither geological accident nor human manufacture fully accounts for. If they are natural formations, why do they so closely resemble artificial pipes? If they are artificial, who made them, and when, and how? The questions circle without resolving, and the pipes themselves offer no clarification, no inscriptions, no context beyond the rock that holds them. They are simply there, impossible and persistent, challenging categories that seemed adequate until their discovery. The pyramids near Xi'an accumulate similar questions. Their forms are too regular for purely natural processes, their positions too deliberate for chance. Yet their purposes remain unknown, their builders unnamed, their relationship to later imperial tombs unclear. Are they ancestors of the tradition that would eventually produce the first emperor's necropolis, precedents that shaped later funerary architecture? Or are they separate phenomena, earlier experiments in monumental construction that left no direct descendants, traditions that ended with the cultures that created them? The mounds offer no inscriptions, no documents, no explanatory texts. They simply rise from the plain, geometric and silent, their slopes eroded by millennia of weather, their contents largely unexplored, their meanings locked beneath tons of accumulated earth. Shimao's walls speak more clearly, but their message still contains gaps that inference cannot fill. Here was power, obviously. Power sufficient to command the labour that built such fortifications. Power that felt itself threatened enough to require such defences. Power that organised itself around a centre deemed worth protecting. But power exercised by whom? Against what threats? For what ultimate purposes? The jade-encrusted skulls embedded in Shimao's foundations suggest ritual practices whose specific meanings elude us. Human sacrifice, possibly, or the incorporation of ancestral remains into structures meant to endure beyond individual lifetimes. But why skulls specifically? Why jade? Why embed them in walls rather than into them in graves? Each detail generates questions rather than answers, implications rather than explanations. Sanxingdui's bronze figures participate in the same generative uncertainty. Their features, those enormous eyes, those geometric ears, those expressions of arrested attention, must have meant something specific to those who made and used them. Were they representations of gods, of ancestors, of mythological beings? Were the exaggerated features symbolic, indicating supernatural perception or divine status? Were they portraits, idealized or distorted, of real individuals whose actual appearance these bronzes somehow captured or commented upon? We can describe what we see, but description is not interpretation, and interpretation requires context that the pits containing these objects did not preserve. They were buried deliberately, possibly destroyed before burial, their ritual lives ended by actions whose purposes we can only guess at. The pit became a tomb for objects, and perhaps also for the meanings those objects once carried, meanings that died with the cultures that created them. Liangzhu's canals and reservoirs survive in traces that aerial photography and archaeological excavation have gradually revealed. Here was hydraulic engineering on a scale that implies sophisticated understanding of water management, of drainage, of the relationship between human settlement and the flows that both sustain and threaten it. The builders of Liangzhu knew how to direct water, how to contain it, how to use it. They knew things about their specific landscape that we are only now rediscovering, through methods that map subsurface features with technologies those ancient engineers could never have imagined. What they achieved without such technologies, through observation and experiment and accumulated experience, represents a form of knowledge that deserves our respect even when we cannot fully reconstruct its content. All of these sites, pipes and pyramids, walls and caves, bronzes and jades, canals and reservoirs, emerge from the same fundamental condition: China before writing, before dynasties, before the historical records that would eventually give shape to the past as later generations understood it. This was not a dark age in the sense of decline or degradation. It was dark only to our vision, unilluminated by the documents that would later make the past visible to those who came after. The peoples of this era lived fully illuminated lives, aware of their own purposes, conscious of their own meanings, embedded in contexts that made sense to them, even if those contexts have since vanished. They were not waiting for history to begin. They were living history, making it, building monuments that would outlast the memories of their makers. The tragedy, if tragedy it is, lies not in their disappearance, but in our ignorance of their presence. For millennia they remained unknown, their achievements unrecognized, their very existence unsuspected. The pyramids near Xi'an were taken for natural hills. The caves of Liangzhu lay beneath rice paddies, their existence revealed only by accident. Sanxingdui slept beneath bean fields until a farmer's hoe struck bronze. Liangzhu's hydraulic network required satellite imagery to perceive in its full extent. Shimao's fortifications, massive though they are, became visible to scholarship only in recent decades. Even Baigong's pipes, despite their strangeness, attracted systematic attention only after industrial development brought workers to the remote slopes where they emerged from stone. The past does not announce itself. It waits to be discovered, and discovery depends on attention we do not always know how to direct. How many sites remain unknown? How many Sanxingdui lie beneath fields not yet surveyed? How many Liangzhus wait beneath ponds not yet drained? How many Shimaos occupy ridges not yet examined with modern instruments? The question cannot be answered, but its implications are significant. What we know of prehistoric China represents not the full picture, but only those portions that chance and effort have so far revealed. The picture will grow as new discoveries emerge, as technologies improve, as attention focuses on regions and periods previously neglected. Each discovery will generate new questions, will complicate narratives that seemed settled, will force revisions to understanding we thought adequate. The past is not fixed. It changes as our knowledge of it changes, as new evidence reshapes old certainties, as mysteries multiply alongside answers. Standing at the edge of what we know, looking back over the landscape of enigmas we've traversed, one feels the humility that true knowledge brings. We know enough to recognize how much we do not know. We have learned enough to understand how much remains to learn. The bronze faces of Sanxingdui stare at us across 30 centuries with expressions we cannot read, their eyes enormous with questions we cannot answer, their silence eloquent with meanings we cannot recover. The jade Kong of Liangzhu turn in museum cases, their surfaces smooth with the touch of hands that held them for purposes we can only imagine. The walls of Shimao stand broken but unbowed, their stones fitted with precision that later ages did not match, their foundations holding skulls whose owners died for reasons we will never know. The caves of Liangzhu open into darkness that human hands created, their chambers echoing with the absence of the workers who carved them, their secrets preserved in the very stone that hides them. These are not our sites, not our monuments, not our mysteries. They belong to peoples who came before, who built according to their own visions, who invested their labour and their lives in creations that outlasted everything, except the creations themselves. We are visitors in their world, tourists in a country whose customs we do not understand, whose language we do not speak, whose meanings remain forever foreign however long we study them. What we owe them is attention, the careful, patient, respectful attention that their achievements deserve, the attention that refuses easy answers and comfortable narratives, the attention that remains open to surprise and revision, the attention that acknowledges mystery as mystery rather than forcing it into explanatory frameworks that cannot contain it. The journey through China's prehistoric enigmas does not end because the mysteries are solved. It ends because the traveller requires rest, because attention flags and energy fails, because even the most persistent inquiry must eventually pause for breath. The mysteries themselves continue, undisturbed by our departure, indifferent to our attention or its absence. The pipes of Baigong remain embedded in their rock. The pyramids of Xi'an continue their slow erosion. The bronzes of Sanxingdui wait in climate-controlled cases for understanding that may never come. The jades of Liangzhu gleam with polish applied by hands that crumbled to dust before the first dynasty was founded. The walls of Shimao hold their ground against time that has already taken everything else. The caves of Liangzhu maintain their silence beneath the paddies, their darkness unbroken by explanations. What remains when the traveller departs is not nothing. It is the sense that something extraordinary happened here, in this land, in these ages before writing and dynasties and the history that would eventually make sense of things. Extraordinary people lived extraordinary lives, built extraordinary monuments, created extraordinary objects, and then vanished so completely that their descendants forgot they had ever existed. The rediscovery of these peoples, these sites, these achievements represents one of the great intellectual adventures of modern archaeology, a gradual illumination of darkness that was dark only because we had not yet learned to see. Every new discovery is a recovery, a retrieval of what was lost, a restoration of memory that time and chance had taken. The earth holds more than we have found. Beneath the fields and forests, beneath the cities and villages, beneath the accumulated layers of later centuries, older traces wait. They wait without urgency, without expectation, without consciousness. But they wait nonetheless, preserved in materials that outlast human memory, recorded in forms that outlast human understanding. Someday perhaps new tools will reveal new sites, new methods will decode old meanings, new generations will ask questions we have not thought to ask and find answers we cannot imagine. Until then, the mysteries remain, eloquent in their silence, significant in their obscurity, profound in their refusal to resolve into the simple narratives we might prefer. The Earth keeps its own calendar, marking time not in years but in layers, each stratum a chapter written in sediment and silence. What we have glimpsed in this journey represents only the surfaces, the exposed edges of mysteries that extend deeper than any excavation has yet reached. For every site we have visited, 100 more remain unexcavated. For every artifact we have examined, 1,000 more lie buried beneath fields where farmers plant rice without knowing what sleeps beneath their furrows. The scope of what we do not know dwarfs what we do, and this proportion shows no sign of changing however long archaeology continues its patient work. Consider again the bygone pipes, those strange metal intrusions in a landscape that should never have known metallurgy so early. The conventional dating, if accepted, places them in an age when the very concept of pipe making should not have existed in this region, when the peoples who inhabited these highlands lived by hunting and gathering and left behind stone tools rather than iron cylinders. The explanation that iron-fixing bacteria created these formations satisfies some researchers, but it raises questions of its own that resist easy resolution. Why here and not elsewhere? Why these particular formations that so closely resemble manufactured conduits? Why the internal hollow structures that seem so perfectly suited to carrying liquid or air? The bacteria hypothesis does not explain so much as relocate the mystery, moving it from human agency to natural process without fully accounting for why natural process should have produced these particular results in this particular place. The pipes remain embedded in their cliff face, silent witnesses to an origin we cannot confirm, their presence a rebuke to confident explanations that do not quite fit the evidence they claim to explain. The pyramids of Xi'an continue their slow collapse into the surrounding plains, their earthen bulk softening with each season of rain, their outlines blurring as vegetation claims what human hands once shaped. We call them tombs, because tombs are what we expect to find beneath mounded earth, and indeed, when excavation has occurred, tombs are what excavators have discovered. Yet the assumption that all such mounds are tombs, that their sole or even primary purpose was burial, may reflect the limitations of our categories rather than the intentions of their builders. Pyramidal forms served many purposes across the ancient world: observation platforms, ritual centers, astronomical markers, symbols of cosmic mountains, nodes in energy networks that modern science cannot measure and therefore dismisses. The Xi'an pyramids align with directions that matter, with angles that recur, with proportions that suggest calculation rather than accident. Their builders knew something, intended something, achieved something, and that something may have extended far beyond the depositing of royal corpses beneath protective mounds. The dead were certainly placed there, surrounded by grave goods and guardian armies and all the apparatus of afterlife provision. But were the dead the reason for the pyramids, or were the pyramids the reason for selecting these particular locations for these particular burials? The question reverses our assumptions without answering itself, opening space for interpretations that conventional archaeology finds uncomfortable, but cannot definitively exclude. What strikes the persistent observer is not the strangeness of any single site, but the patterns that emerge when sites are considered together, the recurring themes and techniques and orientations that suggest connection across distances and centuries that should have precluded contact. The precision of Shimao's walls echoes the precision of Longyu's chambers. The astronomical awareness evident in the pyramid's alignments mirrors the calendrical sophistication implied by Liangzhu's jade discs. The metallurgical achievement of Sanxingdui's bronzes recalls the mysterious metal of the bygone pipes, though millennia and thousands of kilometers separate them. These echoes may be coincidental, the independent invention of similar solutions to similar problems by peoples who never knew of each other's existence, or they may indicate something else entirely. Networks of communication that left no written record, traditions of knowledge that passed from master to student without inscription, a shared heritage of understanding that spread across the vast expanses of what would become China long before China existed as a unified concept. The temptation to see connection everywhere must be balanced against the equally strong temptation to deny connection automatically, to insist that separation in time and space necessarily means separation in thought and technique. Both temptations distort. The truth, whatever it may be, lies somewhere in the territory between them, in a region that careful scholarship approaches asymptotically without ever quite arriving. What we can say with confidence is that something happened in these lands during these ages, something that produced achievements we struggle to explain, monuments we struggle to understand, objects we struggle to interpret. The achievements were real. The monuments stand or have stood. The objects fill museums and storage facilities, demanding attention that scholarship provides in abundance, without thereby resolving the fundamental questions they pose. Standing before a Sanxingdui bronze mask, one feels the weight of accumulated incomprehension, the sediment of all the scholars who have studied these works without reaching consensus on what they mean or who made them or why. The protruding eyes stare past the viewer into distances that are not spatial but temporal, looking back toward origins that remain obscure and forward toward futures that have already become our present without bringing understanding with them. The gold leaf that covers some of these faces catches light and throws it back transformed, as if the masks were still performing whatever function they once served, still communicating with whatever powers or principles they once addressed. We stand in galleries designed to maximize visibility, surrounded by explanatory plaques that explain nothing essential, bathed in illumination that leaves the central darkness untouched. The masks do not explain themselves. They simply are, present and silent and irreducible to the narratives we construct around them. The waters that once filled Liangzhu's canals have long since drained or silted over, but the engineering that created those waterways remains legible to those who know how to read landscapes. The gradients were calculated, the connections were planned. The whole system functioned as a system, not as a collection of independent channels, but as an integrated network that served multiple purposes simultaneously. The jade workshops needed water for cutting and polishing, the rice paddies needed water for irrigation, the ritual centres needed water for purification and ceremony. The transportation routes needed water for moving goods and people. All these needs were met by a single coordinated infrastructure that speaks to organisational capacities we associate with states and bureaucracies, not with the supposedly simple societies that preceded them. Liangzhu may have been a state, may have possessed the hierarchical structures and specialised institutions that statecraft requires, or it may have achieved state-like results through means we do not recognise as state-like, organising collective labour and coordinating complex systems through social mechanisms that left no trace in records that do not exist. The achievement is clear, the mechanism remains opaque. What flourished at Liangzhu for centuries eventually failed. The waters rose, or the climate shifted, or enemies invaded, or internal contradictions accumulated until the system could no longer sustain itself. The city that was not supposed to exist at that age ceased to exist, its population dispersing, its infrastructure decaying, its memory fading until archaeology recovered it from the oblivion that had swallowed so much else. The failure was as mysterious as the flourishing. Nothing in the evidence explains why Liangzhu collapsed when it did rather than earlier or later, why its particular combination of factors proved ultimately unstable, why the knowledge and skills and social arrangements that had worked for so long suddenly stopped working. Civilizations rise and civilizations fall, and the falling is no more explicable than the rising. We construct narratives of decline, identify factors that contributed, name causes that seem plausible, and the mystery remains, stubborn and irreducible, the mystery of why things happen when they happen rather than at some other time. Shimao's fortress walls pose similar questions from different angles. Here was a city built for defense, built at a scale that implies enemies worth defending against, built with techniques that required expertise and organization beyond what we expect to find so early in these highlands. The skulls embedded in the walls speak to violence and sacrifice, to rituals that sanctified construction through death, to beliefs about the power of human remains that we can glimpse but not fully grasp. Young women died so that walls might stand, their skulls becoming building materials, their deaths becoming part of the structure's foundation. This practice shocks modern sensibilities, but the shock is itself informative, revealing how distant we are from the worldview that made such deaths meaningful, that understood them as necessary contributions to collective projects rather than as atrocities. Shimao's builders lived in a different moral universe, operated according to different assumptions about life and death and the proper relationships between them. We cannot approve, and should not pretend to approve, but we can recognize that approval is not the point, that understanding requires setting aside our categories long enough to see how different categories might function, might make sense within their own frameworks, however alien those frameworks appear from outside. The Liangzhu caves extend this sense of alienation into the realm of labour itself, into the question of why human beings would invest such enormous effort in creating spaces that serve no purpose we can identify. The chisel marks number in the billions. The stone removed would fill valleys. The time required, even with large teams working continuously, stretches across generations, and when the work was done, what resulted? underground chambers that were immediately sealed, hidden from view, preserved in darkness until modern excavations brought them back to light. The conventional assumption that purposes must be practical, that effort on this scale requires practical justification, fails completely when applied to Liangzhu. The caves are impractical by any standard we know how to apply. They produced nothing, stored nothing useful, sheltered no one from anything. They simply existed, carved from living rock by hands that never expected the carving to be seen or appreciated or understood. Unless appreciation and understanding are not the point. Unless the carving itself was the purpose, the process rather than the product, the act of creation rather than the thing created. Ritual interpretations of monumental labour suggest that the work itself was meaningful, that every chisel stroke was a prayer or an offering or a contribution to some cosmic project that had nothing to do with utility as we understand it. The workers who carved Liangzhu may have believed they were participating in something that transcended their individual lives, something that connected them to powers or principles or ancestors that made the effort worthwhile regardless of outcome. The caves were not means to ends. They were ends in themselves, achievements whose achievement was the point, monuments whose meaning was entirely in the making. This interpretation explains nothing in the conventional sense. It identifies a category of explanation without filling in the content, tells us that religious or ritual purposes were involved without specifying what those purposes actually were, but it opens space that purely practical interpretations close off, space for understandings that do not require modern cost-benefit analyses to justify ancient behaviours. The people who carved Liangzhu were not like us. They thought differently, valued differently, invested their labour differently. Their caves are evidence of that difference, evidence that we cannot fully decode but can at least acknowledge as evidence of something beyond our current comprehension. The pattern repeats across all these sites, the same gesture of acknowledgement that refuses to become explanation. The Beigong pipes may be natural or artificial, but either way they indicate something we do not understand about conditions in that region during that time. The Xi'an pyramids were certainly built by human hands, but the knowledge that guided those hands remains largely inaccessible to us. Sanxingdui's bronzes emerge from foundries whose operators possess skills we can admire but cannot fully replicate, serving functions we can guess at but cannot confirm. Liangzhu's jades passed through hands that shaped them according to principles we cannot reconstruct from the products alone, however many products we examine. Shimao's walls enclosed a society whose structure and beliefs in daily practices remain largely opaque, despite decades of excavation and analysis. Liangzhu's caves yawn beneath the surface, empty of the content that might explain them, full only of darkness and possibility and unanswered questions. What unites these sites is not any single explanation, but the shared condition of exceeding explanation, of gesturing toward meanings that remain beyond reach, however far scholarship extends its grasp. They are all, in their different ways, evidence of human capacities that we tend to underestimate, achievements that we tend to explain away, mysteries that we tend to domesticate through premature interpretation. The comfortable narrative of linear progress, of steady improvement from primitive origins towards civilized modernity, does not survive contact with these sites. They force revision, demand reconsideration, insist that the past was stranger and more capable and more mysterious than our textbooks acknowledge. The bronze faces of Sanxingdui stare from their cases, unblinking, unexhausted by the attention lavished upon them, inexhaustible in their capacity to provoke wonder and frustration in equal measure. Their gold leaf catches light from fixtures designed by museum curators, trained in conservation and display. Their protruding eyes seem to track visitors who move through galleries chattering into phones about other topics, barely glancing at objects that represent culminations of technical and artistic achievement we cannot match today. The masks do not mind the inattention. They have waited millennia already and can wait millennia more, secure in their strangeness, confident in their refusal to resolve into categories that would make them manageable and therefore forgettable. They are unforgettable precisely because they are unmanageable, because they resist the interpretive frameworks that would neutralize their challenge, because they remain other when so much else has been assimilated into the familiar. The jades of Liangzhu emit their own subtle challenge from adjacent cases, their surfaces polished to perfections that should not have been possible with the tools available, their forms standardized to degrees that imply templates and traditions and institutions of transmission. Someone taught someone how to make these objects. That teaching continued across generations, maintaining standards that hardly varied over centuries. The knowledge was embodied in practice, passed from hand to hand, lodged in muscle memory and trained perception rather than in texts that could survive the collapse of the society that produced them. When Liangzhu fell, the jade working tradition fell with it, or rather dispersed and transformed and eventually disappeared, leaving only the objects themselves as evidence that it had ever existed. The objects remember what their makers forgot. They carry forward knowledge that no living person possesses, knowledge frozen in form and surface and proportion, knowledge that reverse engineering can approximate but never fully recover. The walls of Shimao remember differently, remembering violence and construction, remembering the bodies that became part of their structure, remembering the calculations that determined their courses and the labour that raised their heights. Stone upon stone, fitted with care that seems excessive for mere fortification, aligned with attention that suggests purposes beyond the purely military. The walls defended, yes, but they also meant. They communicated something to those who saw them, something about power and permanence and the capacity to mobilize resources that less impressive structures would not convey. They were propaganda in stone, statements of achievement intended to impress and intimidate, monuments to the social arrangements that made them possible. Those arrangements are gone now, dissolved into the anonymity of unrecorded history. But the walls remain, broken but still standing in places, their message still partly legible to those who learn to read the language of ancient masonry. The caves of Liangzhu remember darkness. Remember the chisel strokes that created them. Remember the moment when the last worker withdrew, and the entrance was sealed and silence descended to last for 2,000 years or more. They remember without consciousness, record without intention, preserve without purpose. The grooves left by tools trace patterns that scholars have measured and mapped, patterns that seem regular, deliberate, meaningful, yet whose meaning remains undetermined despite all the measuring and mapping. The caves were not decoration, and were not storage, and were not temples in any sense we understand. They were something else, something we lack vocabulary to name because our vocabulary developed in contexts where such things did not exist. The caves create categories rather than filling existing ones. They force expansion of what we think possible, what we think humans might choose to do, what we think effort might be invested in. This is what all these sites share, finally. Not their mysteries, but their capacity to force expansion, to break open categories that had seemed sufficient, to remind us that human possibility exceeds our imagination, however capacious that imagination considers itself to be. We are the descendants of peoples capable of building these things, and we have forgotten how. We are the inheritors of traditions that produce these objects, and we cannot continue them. We are the beneficiaries of knowledge that enabled these achievements, and we do not possess it. Something was lost when these cultures collapsed, something that the subsequent history of China did not recover, something that even modern technology cannot fully replace. The loss is not merely technical. Tools can be reinvented, methods can be rediscovered, skills can be relearned through experimentation and practice. What cannot be recovered is the context that made these achievements meaningful, the worldviews that motivated them, the social arrangements that enabled them, the accumulated understanding that guided hands and shaped decisions. We can replicate forms without replicating meanings. We can reproduce objects without reproducing the lives that produced them. We can excavate sites without excavating the consciousness of those who built them. The inner world of these ancient peoples remains inaccessible, locked behind barriers that no methodological innovation can breach, preserved only in traces that tantalize without satisfying, that suggest without revealing, that point toward understandings we cannot reach. And yet the traces themselves are precious beyond measure, precious because they are all we have, precious because they connect us, however tenuously, to human experiences otherwise completely lost. Every Liangzhu jade, every Sanxingdui bronze, every Shimao wall, every Liangzhu chamber represents a point of contact between their world and ours, a place where the past touches the present, where the dead communicate with the living through forms that have outlasted their creators by millennia. The communication is imperfect, the message is garbled, the meaning is lost, but something comes through nonetheless, something that justifies the effort of excavation and analysis and interpretation, something that rewards attention even when attention cannot resolve the questions it raises. The pipes of Baigong raise questions that geology cannot fully answer. The pyramids of Xi'an raise questions that archaeology cannot fully answer. The bronzes of Sanxingdui raise questions that art history cannot fully answer. The jades of Liangzhu raise questions that anthropology cannot fully answer. The walls of Shimao raise questions that sociology cannot fully answer. The caves of Longyu raise questions that no discipline can fully answer. Questions that exceed the boundaries of any single field. Questions that require integration of perspectives that academia keeps separate. These are not problems to be solved, but mysteries to be inhabited. Not puzzles that yield to sufficient cleverness, but koans that transform those who engage them seriously. The engagement is the point. The transformation is the reward. The mystery is the meaning. The transformation is the meaning, and meaning transforms even as we pursue it, shifting beneath our feet like the silt that buries these ancient places, like the sediment that accumulates over jade and bronze and stone until excavation reveals what time had hidden. To inhabit these mysteries is to accept incompleteness as the natural condition of understanding, to recognize that knowledge itself has limits that no accumulation of data can transcend, to discover humility in the face of achievements we cannot explain and perhaps cannot equal. The ancients who built these places knew something we do not know. They possessed capabilities we cannot reconstruct. They operated within frameworks we cannot enter. And they left their works behind them like messages in bottles cast into the ocean of time, messages we have found and opened and read without comprehension, messages whose meaning we sense without grasping, whose significance we feel without articulating. The feeling itself is significant. The sense of presence that visitors report at these sites, the uncanny awareness that something important happened here, that something important was created here, that something important remains here even when we cannot identify what it is. This feeling is not mere projection, not simple romanticism, not the imagination filling voids that reason cannot occupy. The feeling responds to something real, something embedded in the stones and the bronzes and the jades, something that survives the death of the cultures that created it, something that communicates across millennia through channels that scholarship has not mapped because scholarship lacks instruments sensitive enough to detect them. Call it resonance, call it presence, call it the accumulated weight of intentionality that saturates objects made with extraordinary care over extraordinary time by people for whom making was a form of meaning-making, for whom craft was a form of philosophy, for whom the physical and the spiritual interpenetrated so thoroughly that the distinction we draw between them would have seemed incomprehensible. Every jade disc from Liangzhu carries this saturation. The hours required to grind the stone, the generations required to develop the techniques, the social organization required to support artisans who spent their lives producing objects of no utilitarian value. All of this concentrated itself into the object, became part of what the object is, remains accessible to those who handle the jade with sufficient attention. The coolness of the stone against the palm, the weight that feels simultaneously substantial and delicate, the way light passes through the material differently depending on angle and source, the smoothness that results from polishing that continued long past any practical necessity. These sensory qualities are not incidental to what the jade means, but constitutive of it. The meaning lives in the matter. The spirit dwells in the stone. What seems to modernize like primitive animism begins to seem like sophisticated phenomenology when one actually handles these objects, when one allows the objects to communicate through channels that words cannot adequately describe. The bronzes of Sanxingdui communicate similarly, though their register differs. Where the jades speak in whispers, in subtle variations of translucency and texture, the bronzes proclaim. The giant faces with their bulging eyes and elongated ears were not meant to be subtle. They were meant to announce presence, to declare power, to manifest forces that ordinary perception could not detect. The masks made the invisible visible. The statues gave form to the formless. The trees with their strange fruits and stranger birds created images of realms that existed beyond the realm of daily experience. Realms that shamans claimed to visit in trance. Realms that the community believed were as real as the fields they cultivated and the rivers that flooded annually. The bronzes were not representations in our sense of the term, not pictures of things seen elsewhere. They were manifestations, things that became present through being depicted, forces that entered the world through the gates that skillful casting opened. To stand before them now, behind museum glass in climate-controlled galleries, is to feel echoes of the power they once channeled. Power diminished by decontextualization but not entirely eliminated. Power that still pulses faintly in the metal itself, in the forms that the metal holds, in the eyes that still stare outward after 3,000 years. What did those eyes see? The question cannot be answered because seeing is not merely optical, not merely the reception of light by retina and the processing of signals by brain. Seeing is shaped by expectation, by training, by the concepts available to organize raw sensation into meaningful perception. The Sanxingdui people saw a world populated by forces we do not recognize, organized by principles we do not share, meaningful in ways we cannot access. Their bronzes were instruments for seeing as much as objects to be seen. The masks enabled perception as well as representing it. The eyes that bulge outward from the faces were windows in both directions, windows through which the wearer looked out at spiritual realms, windows through which spiritual forces looked into the human world. The reciprocity was essential. The seeing was mutual. The boundary between observer and observed dissolved in ritual context that transformed ordinary perception into something else entirely, something our vocabulary cannot capture because our experience does not include it. We can hypothesize, we can analogize, we can draw parallels with shamanic practices documented ethnographically elsewhere, practices that involve altered states of consciousness, practices that enable practitioners to see what ordinary perception misses. But hypothesis is not knowledge, analogy is not understanding, parallel is not equivalence. The specific content of Sanxingdui's spiritual experience remains inaccessible, locked in the bronzes that witnessed it, encoded in forms whose key we do not possess. The faces continue to stare, the eyes continue to bulge, the message continues to be sent, but the receivers capable of processing that message no longer exist, were destroyed along with the culture that created them, were buried along with the knowledge that enabled their functioning. Shimao presents different mysteries, mysteries of violence and construction, mysteries of organization and collapse. The massive walls that enclose the stone city speak of conflict on a scale that precedes historical documentation, conflict that required mobilization of resources and labor that only sophisticated polities can achieve. Someone commanded the work, someone organized the workers, someone decided where walls would rise and how thick they would be, and what materials would compose them. Someone possessed authority that others recognized, authority that translated into the coordinated effort of thousands over decades or longer. The jade artifacts embedded in the walls suggest that this authority had spiritual as well as political dimensions, that the leaders who commanded construction also mediated between human communities and forces beyond human control. The skulls that appear in ritual contexts suggest that this mediation required sacrifice, that the forces propitiated were dangerous, that their favor had to be purchased with blood as well as jade. The combination unsettles modern sensibilities. We prefer our ancient civilizations either brutal or beautiful, either violent or refined. Shimao insists on both simultaneously. The same culture that produced sophisticated jade work also practiced human sacrifice on a significant scale. The same walls that demonstrate engineering capability also demonstrate willingness to kill, to capture, to take lives for purposes that remain unclear. Were the skulls those of enemies defeated in battle? Were they those of community members selected for sacrifice? Were they those of individuals whose death served some purpose we cannot reconstruct from archaeological evidence alone? The skulls themselves do not answer. The walls that contain them do not explain. The city speaks volumes about what its builders could do without revealing why they chose to do it. The bygone pipes pose questions of a different order entirely, questions that seem to exceed the framework within which the other mysteries operate. The pipes are either natural or artificial. If natural, they represent geological processes we do not fully understand, processes that created iron-rich tubes in rock over millions of years through mechanisms that remain disputed among specialists. If artificial, they represent technology we cannot attribute to any known ancient culture, technology that would require industrial capabilities that supposedly developed only in recent centuries. The first explanation strains credulity in one direction. The second strains it in another. Neither explanation feels satisfying because neither explanation accounts for all the features that investigators have documented: the internal structure, the external form, the material composition, the spatial distribution. The mountain that contains the pipes offers no testimony. Mount Baigong rises in Qinghai province, in terrain that seems inhospitable to advanced civilization, terrain that lacks the agricultural potential that supported Liangzhu and Sanxingdui, that lacks the defensive advantages that Shimao exploited. If people made the pipes, why would they make them here? What purpose could pipes serve in this remote location? What infrastructure supported the work of creating them? What happened to that infrastructure, to those workers, to the knowledge that guided their efforts? The questions multiply without generating answers. The pipes remain embedded in the rock, neither clearly natural nor clearly artificial, neither obviously ancient nor certainly modern, neither definitively explained nor comfortably mysterious. They exist in a liminal zone where categories fail, where normal assumptions about what is possible break down, where the careful distinctions that organize archaeological thinking lose their utility. Some investigators have proposed extraterrestrial origins. The proposal is not scientific in any conventional sense, but it emerges from the same frustration that all serious investigators feel when confronting evidence that fits no available framework. When terrestrial explanations seem inadequate, when geological processes seem insufficient, when human capabilities seem exceeded, the mind reaches for alternatives however implausible. The reaching is itself significant. It indexes the depth of the mystery, the genuineness of the puzzle, the resistance that the pipes offer to comfortable explanation. Serious scientists do not propose extraterrestrial origins for phenomena that fit comfortably within established understanding. They propose such origins only when established understanding fails, when the alternatives have been exhausted, when something seems to demand explanation that nothing available can provide. This is not to endorse the extraterrestrial hypothesis. The hypothesis almost certainly fails for reasons that careful analysis would reveal, but the impulse behind it, the sense that something strange requires strange explanation, the feeling that normal frameworks have been exceeded, this impulse deserves respect, deserves attention, deserves acknowledgement even from those who will ultimately reject the conclusions it generates. The pipes at Baigong are strange. Their strangeness is not projection or misperception or insufficient data. Their strangeness is a feature of the pipes themselves, a property that additional investigation has confirmed rather than eliminated, a quality that remains after all conventional explanations have been considered and found wanting. To dismiss the strangeness is to miss what makes the pipes significant. To explain away the strangeness is to explain away the pipes themselves. The pyramids of Xi'an present mysteries of a different character, mysteries not of origin but of purpose, not of creation but of meaning. The mounds that dot the landscape near the ancient capital are unquestionably artificial, unquestionably ancient, unquestionably tombs of rulers and nobles from dynasties whose names we know and whose histories we can read. They are not mysterious in the sense that the Baigong pipes are mysterious. Their existence makes sense within frameworks we possess. Their construction required nothing that ancient Chinese civilization could not provide. Their function as burial sites fits patterns documented extensively across cultures and centuries. And yet the pyramids remain mysterious despite this contextual clarity. Mysterious because their specific contents remain largely unknown, because excavation has proceeded slowly when it has proceeded at all, because much that lies beneath the mounds has never been examined with modern methods. The tomb of the first emperor presents the most famous case. The terracotta army that guards his burial was discovered only in 1974, after lying undisturbed for more than 2,000 years. The warriors stunned the world with their scale, their individuality, their preservation. 8,000 figures, each with distinct features, each once painted in colours that time has stripped away, each positioned according to military formations that reflect actual organisation of actual armies. The discovery transformed understanding of what ancient Chinese artisans could achieve, what ancient Chinese rulers could command, what ancient Chinese culture considered appropriate investment in death. And yet, the discovery has not been completed. The central tomb itself, the mound that covers the actual burial chamber of the first emperor, remains unopened. What lies within? Ancient texts describe a tomb of extraordinary elaboration. Mercury rivers flowing through model landscapes, crossbow traps protecting against intrusion, treasures accumulating over decades of preparation. Are the descriptions accurate? Are they exaggeration? Are they partial truths that understate rather than overstate what the tomb contains? The mercury provides indirect evidence. Soil samples from the mound show mercury concentrations far exceeding natural levels, concentrations consistent with the presence of significant quantities of the liquid metal beneath the surface. If the mercury is there, what else might be? If one element of ancient description proves accurate, might other elements prove accurate as well? The questions hang over the mound like the air itself, thick with possibility, dense with implication. To open the tomb would answer questions that have persisted for millennia. To open the tomb would also risk destroying what opening reveals. The paradox paralyzes decision. The tomb remains closed. The questions remain open. The mystery continues. The Xi'an pyramids beyond the First Emperor's Mound present different variations on similar themes. Royal tombs from earlier dynasties, from the Han that followed the Qin, from periods whose records are less complete and whose archaeology is less developed. Some have been excavated partially. Some have been looted extensively. Some remain unexplored for reasons of resources or politics or simple neglect. Each mound contains or contained burials whose elaboration reflected the status of those interred, whose contents included artifacts that would illuminate periods whose material culture remains inadequately documented. The pyramids are archives waiting to be read, libraries whose books have never been opened, museums whose collections have never been catalogued. They stand in fields where farmers plant crops, in suburbs where developers build housing, in landscapes that have changed around them while they themselves have persisted, altered by weathering but not by investigation, diminished by erosion but not by excavation. What do the unopened tombs preserve? Jade suits wired with gold thread, preserving bodies that have long since decomposed within their green enclosures. Bronze vessels filled with grain and wine and delicacies that the dead were expected to consume in afterlives, whose geography the living mapped in detail. Lacquerware painted with scenes that depicted mythological narratives whose specific content varied from region to region and period to period. Silk garments embroidered with patterns whose symbolism scholars still debate. Manuscripts written on bamboo strips, on silk fabric, on materials that survive poorly unless conditions prove exceptionally favourable. The potential is enormous. The actuality remains unknown. The pyramids keep their secrets not through resistance to investigation but through sheer quantity, through the impossibility of excavating everything, through the choices that limited resources force upon those who would uncover the past. And beneath all these specific mysteries lies the meta-mystery that encompasses them, the question that applies to Baigong and Xi'an and Sanxingdui and Liangzhu and Shimao and Longyu alike. How did these achievements become possible before history began recording the processes that enabled them? How did capabilities develop that seemed to require extensive prior development, prior experimentation, prior accumulation of knowledge that no earlier evidence documents? Each site implies predecessors that archaeology has not found. Each achievement requires foundations that excavation has not revealed. Either the foundations exist somewhere still buried, waiting for discovery that may never come, or the achievements emerged more rapidly than developmental logic suggests possible through processes we cannot reconstruct because we lack comparative examples. The development of bronze casting at Sanxingdui presents the problem in acute form. The bronzes appear suddenly in the archaeological record, already sophisticated, already massive, already displaying techniques that seem to require generations of refinement. Where are the earlier examples? Where are the smaller castings, the failed experiments, the gradual improvements that should connect crude beginnings to accomplished endings? The record shows only the endings. The beginnings remain absent, remain missing, remain either undiscovered or non-existent, either buried beneath sediment that future excavation might remove, or simply not there, never created, bypassed somehow through processes that explanatory frameworks cannot accommodate. The jade working at Liangzhu presents similar puzzles. The earliest jades are already accomplished. The techniques appear already mastered. The forms demonstrate understanding that should have required extensive experimentation to develop. Did the experimentation occur elsewhere, in regions that Liangzhu colonists brought their skills from? Did it occur in materials that left no archaeological trace, in practices that produced nothing durable enough to survive? Did some acceleration occur that compressed developmental processes into timeframes shorter than normal learning would require? The questions point toward absences that may never be filled, toward gaps that may prove structural rather than contingent, toward mysteries that additional excavation may deepen rather than resolve. The walls at Shimao, the caves at Liangzhu, the pipes at Baigong, each site presents its own variation on this fundamental problem. Each appears suddenly. Each demonstrates capabilities that seem to require prior development that evidence does not document. Each forces consideration of possibilities that normal frameworks exclude. Perhaps development occurred differently than we assume. Perhaps learning accelerated under conditions we do not understand. Perhaps knowledge transferred through channels we cannot trace. Perhaps much of what we think we know about how ancient peoples acquired their capabilities is simply wrong, based on assumptions that these sites collectively undermine. The undermining is itself valuable. The assumptions needed examination. The frameworks required testing. The certainties warranted questioning. These sites perform that service, not by providing answers, but by demonstrating that answers remain elusive, by revealing that questions persist despite sophisticated investigation, by showing that the past retains depths that the present cannot plumb, however advanced its methods become. The mystery is not failure of method, but feature of reality. The incompleteness is not gap to be filled, but structure to be acknowledged. Understanding has limits. Knowledge reaches boundaries. The ancient peoples who built these places exceeded those limits, transcended those boundaries, achieved what our understanding cannot encompass. They remain beyond us even as we study them. They persist as puzzles we cannot solve. They continue to challenge assumptions we did not know we held until the challenge revealed them. The night deepens over all these sites simultaneously. Over Qinghai, where the pipes rest in their mountain. Over Shanxi, where the pyramids cast shadows across plains that once supported capitals. Over Sichuan, where the bronzes sleep in their museum cases. Over Zhejiang, where the jades lie in collections scattered across continents. Over Shanxi again, where the fortress walls crumble slowly across millennia. Over Zhejiang again, where the caves exhale their moisture into darkness that never ends. The night connects them. The darkness unifies them. The mystery that each embodies separately becomes a single mystery when the sun withdraws its illumination and leaves only questions, questions that the dawn will not answer, questions that centuries of dawns have not answered, questions that perhaps cannot be answered in any terms that language provides or that investigation enables, but the questions continue to be asked. Archaeologists continue to excavate, scientists continue to analyze, scholars continue to interpret. The work proceeds despite the incompleteness that attends it, despite the limits that constrain it, despite the mysteries that motivate it, without ever yielding to it. The work is its own justification. The pursuit is its own reward. The engagement with these ancient places transforms those who undertake it, expands their sense of what humans have accomplished, deepens their appreciation for capabilities they cannot replicate, humbles their assumptions about what they know and what remains unknown. To walk among the pyramids of Xi'an, to descend into the caves of Liangzhu, to stand before the bronzes of Sanxingdui, to hold a jade from Liangzhu, to touch the walls of Shimao, to contemplate the pipes of Baigong. Each encounter changes something in those who undertake it. Each contact leaves traces. Each mystery marks those who engage it with marks that persist long after the engagement ends, marks that become part of who they are, marks that connect them to the ancient peoples who created these wonders, and to all the subsequent peoples who have wondered at them. The marks accumulate across generations. They pass from those who first stumbled upon these places to those who excavated them, to those who study them now, to those who will study them tomorrow. An unbroken chain of wonder that stretches backward to the builders themselves and forward to descendants not yet born. The chain binds us to mysteries we did not create and cannot resolve, to questions we inherited and must bequeath, to enigmas that outlast individual lives and perhaps outlast civilizations themselves. We are not the first to stand puzzled before these achievements. We will not be the last. And yet something shifts when one considers these sites together, when one allows the Baigong pipes, and the Xi'an pyramids, and the Sanxingdui bronzes, and the Liangzhu jades, and the Shimao fortress, and the Liangzhu caves to occupy the same mental space simultaneously. Patterns emerge that individual study obscures. Connections suggest themselves that focused investigation cannot perceive. The whole exceeds the sum of its parts in ways that transform understanding, even as they deepen mystery. What emerges is not a single ancient civilization but something more elusive, a landscape of capability, a terrain of achievement, a geography of the impossible made real through means we cannot reconstruct. Consider what these sites share despite their differences. Each demonstrates technical sophistication that appears suddenly in the archaeological record. Each suggests organizational capacity that seems to require precedence the evidence does not document. Each exhibits aesthetic refinement that implies cultural development, extending far beyond what surviving materials reveal. Each poses the same fundamental question in its own particular idiom. How did they know? How did people working with tools we consider primitive, operating within societies we imagine as simple, laboring under conditions we assume were harsh, achieve what modern replication cannot accomplish? The question echoes across Qinghai Province and Shanxi Plains and Sichuan Basins and Zhejiang wetlands, the same question asked by pipes and pyramids and bronzes and jades and walls and caves, the same question receiving no satisfactory answer despite centuries of inquiry. The lack of answers is itself instructive. It reveals the limits of archaeological method, the constraints of scientific analysis, the boundaries of historical imagination. We approach these sites with tools forged in the modern world, with frameworks developed from modern assumptions, with questions shaped by modern concerns. The ancient builders operated under different constraints, pursued different purposes, embodied different understandings. The gap between their world and ours may be unbridgeable, not because evidence is lacking, but because the very categories through which we comprehend reality differ fundamentally from those through which they comprehended it. We seek to explain them in our terms. Perhaps they can only be understood in their own terms, terms that vanished with the cultures that created them, terms that no excavation will recover because they were never inscribed in materials that survive. This possibility haunts archaeological investigation without invalidating it. The work continues, the excavations proceed, the analyses multiply. Each new discovery adds information even as it deepens uncertainty, expands knowledge even as it reveals the vastness of what remains unknown. The dialectic between knowing and not knowing drives scholarship forward, propels investigation through decades of effort, sustains commitment across generations of researchers. The mystery is not obstacle, but engine. The incompleteness is not failure, but motivation. Understanding advances precisely because it never arrives, precisely because each answer generates new questions, precisely because the ancient peoples who built these places remain perpetually beyond our grasp, even as we perpetually reach toward them. The reaching matters. The gesture of extension toward what exceeds us transforms those who make it. To genuinely engage these sites, to honestly confront what they represent, requires a kind of intellectual humility that modern confidence often obscures. We live in an age that assumes progress, that imagines the present as apex and the past as prelude, that measures achievement by standards that privilege the contemporary. These sites disrupt that assumption. They demonstrate that peoples without electricity, without metallurgical theory, without mathematical notation, without the vast apparatus of modern knowledge accomplished what we cannot replicate. They suggest that different does not mean deficient, that alternative paths toward capability exist, that the route we've taken is not the only route and may not be the best route, and certainly is not the final route. The humility they impose is not humiliation but education. The limits they reveal are not defeats but invitations. Invitations to expand imagination, to question assumptions, to remain open to possibilities that familiar frameworks exclude. The darkness that covers these sites now covers also the villages and cities of modern China, the laboratories where scientists analyze ancient materials, the universities where scholars debate interpretations, the museums where artifacts rest in climate-controlled cases behind glass that separates the ancient from those who seek to understand it. The same night enfolds builders and investigators, creation and analysis, mystery and the perpetual effort to resolve mystery. Under that darkness, the pipes at Baigong continue their inexplicable existence, their iron and their placement and their purpose remaining as opaque as when they were discovered. Perhaps more opaque as each proposed explanation has fallen short of convincing demonstration. Under that darkness, the pyramids of Xi'an continue their massive presence, their construction requiring resources and organization that strain comprehension, their relationship to the landscape suggesting purposes that exceed mere burial even for divine emperors. Under that darkness, the bronzes of Sanxingdui continue their disturbing vigil, their eyes staring outward toward realms we cannot perceive, their faces embodying truths we cannot decode, their craftsmanship testifying to capabilities we cannot replicate. Under that same darkness, the jades of Liangzhu rest in collections around the world, each one a fragment of a culture that water ultimately claimed, each one carrying marks of tools and techniques and aesthetic choices that accumulated across centuries before any Chinese character was written on any surface that survives. Under that darkness, the walls of Shimao continue their slow dissolution, their stones loosening under the patient assault of weather and time, their jade fragments remaining embedded as evidence of beliefs that no text records. Under that darkness, the caves of Liangzhu breathe their eternal moisture into chambers that human hands carved through rock, for purposes no document explains, their pillars supporting mountains of stone that required removal, measured in the millions of tons. The darkness unifies what daylight separates. The night reveals what investigation conceals. The fundamental mystery that connects these places despite their differences, the shared enigma that transcends the particular puzzles each presents. What is that shared enigma? Perhaps it is simply human capability itself, the capacity of people to exceed what circumstances seem to permit, to accomplish what conditions seem to prevent, to create what theory suggests should be impossible. Perhaps the mystery is not what the builders knew, but what they were. Beings whose potential vastly exceeded any environment's constraints, whose creativity outran any period's limitations, whose achievements mocked any assumption about what could or could not be done with given tools under given conditions. We seek explanations in technology, in organization, in cultural development. Perhaps the explanation lies in human nature itself, in possibilities inherent in the species that occasional individuals or groups actualize while most remain content within narrower bounds. This possibility is both comforting and disturbing. Comforting because it locates the mystery within humanity, rather than requiring intervention from elsewhere, demanding technologies that vanished without trace, or invoking civilizations that predated all known history. Disturbing because it suggests that the same capability lies dormant within contemporary humans. The same potential remains largely unrealized. The same achievements might emerge if circumstances aligned as they apparently aligned in Qinghai and Shanxi, and Sichuan and Zhejiang millennia ago. What conditions produced the builders of these sites? What circumstances released capabilities that normally remain latent? What forces aligned to enable the extraordinary, while ordinarily only the ordinary manifests? The questions rebound from the ancient past toward the present, from those who built to those who study, from mysteries of creation to mysteries of potential awaiting realization. The moon rises over the Kunlun Mountains, casting silver light across the plateau where the Baigong pipes descend into stone that should not contain them. The same moon rises over the plains of Xi'an, illuminating pyramids that dwarf the monuments of other civilizations, monuments whose construction remains incompletely understood despite generations of investigation. The same moon rises over Sichuan, over museums that house bronzes whose faces capture the moonlight in eye sockets that seem almost to see, almost to register the passage of time and the procession of those who pause before them. The same moon rises over Zhejiang, over excavations where archaeologists uncovered waterways that once supported cities now beneath centuries of silt, over quarries where limestone once extracted became pillars that support mountains of unmoved stone. The same moon rises over Shanxi, over fortress walls that once protected inhabitants we cannot name, that once enclosed beliefs we cannot specify, that once served purposes we cannot determine with confidence despite decades of study. The moonlight connects what political boundaries separate, what chronological distinctions divide, what scholarly specialization partitions into manageable fields of expertise. Under the moon, the sites become a single constellation, a pattern inscribed across Chinese geography as constellations inscribe patterns across the sky. The Baigong pipes anchor the western extreme, mysterious and lonely in their mountain setting. The Liangzhu caves anchor the east, elaborate and social in their coastal location. Between them, the pyramids and the bronzes and the jades and the walls mark points in a pattern that no one designed but that nonetheless exists. A pattern that only becomes visible when individual sites are allowed to resonate with one another, to speak across the distances that separate them, to suggest connections that no evidence confirms but that imagination cannot entirely dismiss. The pattern suggests that what we call Chinese civilization did not emerge from simple beginnings, but from complex ones, not from crude precursors, but from sophisticated antecedents, not from emptiness, but from fullness that somehow emptied, leaving behind traces too substantial to ignore and too incomplete to interpret. The pipes and pyramids and bronzes and jades and walls and caves are not anomalies interrupting a narrative of gradual development, but evidence that the narrative requires revision, that assumptions about origins need reconsideration, that the story we tell about how civilization emerged in this part of the world may be wrong in fundamental ways that these sites collectively reveal. The revelation is uncomfortable. It disturbs frameworks that generations of scholarship have constructed. It challenges assumptions that centuries of investigation have reinforced. It requires abandonment of certainties that we did not know were certainties until they were challenged. But the discomfort serves truth. The disturbance serves understanding. The challenge serves knowledge by revealing its limits, by exposing its assumptions, by demonstrating that what we think we know always rests on foundations that deeper investigation may undermine. The sites perform this service not through answers but through questions, not through resolution but through perpetual problematization, not through completion but through the incompleteness that drives continued inquiry. And so the inquiry continues, will continue, must continue as long as these places persist and people pause before them wondering what they mean. The Beigong pipes will continue to puzzle, their iron defying explanations that seemed adequate until examined closely, their placement suggesting purposes that imagination supplies but evidence does not confirm. The Xi'an pyramids will continue to loom, their mass-proclaiming achievements that required resources and knowledge that full understanding still eludes. The Sanxingdui bronzes will continue to stare, their eyes capturing light in ways that seem almost intentional, their forms embodying concepts that no surviving text explains. The Liangzhu jades will continue to gleam, their surfaces carrying patterns that accumulated meaning across centuries, meaning that the culture's collapse scattered beyond recovery. The Shima walls will continue to crumble, their embedded jades catching occasional light as the stone that holds them slowly releases its grip. The Liangzhu caves will continue to breathe, their darkness uninterrupted by the centuries that pass above them, their silence unbroken by the sounds of investigation that briefly disturbs and then withdraws. These places endure. They outlast the civilizations that created them. They outlast the civilizations that studied them. They will outlast our own civilization, whatever form its conclusion takes. They constitute a heritage not of answers but of questions, not of knowledge but of mystery, not of what humanity has understood, but of what humanity has accomplished beyond understanding. They are gifts from ancestors we cannot name to descendants we cannot imagine, gifts whose value lies precisely in their resistance to appropriation, in their refusal to yield to interpretation, in their persistence as enigmas that connect all who encounter them across the abysses of time that separate generation from generation, culture from culture, world from world. The night deepens toward its darkest hour. The hour before dawn begins its slow return. Across the Chinese landscape, the sites rest in their various repose. The pipes still in their mountain, the pyramids settled on their plains, the bronzes silent in their cases, the jades cool in their collections, the walls patient on their ridges, the caves quiet in their depths. They wait as they have waited for millennia, as they will wait for millennia more, as time measured in human generations passes over them like weather, marking them but not altering what is essential about them. What is essential is the mystery itself, the refusal to resolve, the persistence of questions that answers do not silence. Dawn will come, it always comes. The sun will rise over the eastern mountains and light will spread across provinces where these sites lie, illuminating surfaces that investigation has examined and depths that investigation has not reached. Archaeologists will return to their excavations, to their laboratories, to their libraries. The work will continue. The questions will persist. The mystery will endure, deepening even as understanding advances, expanding even as knowledge accumulates, remaining always beyond the final grasp that would transform it from mystery into history, from wonder into information, from enigma into data. But perhaps that transformation should never come. Perhaps the value of these places lies precisely in their resistance to it. Perhaps they serve humanity better as perpetual questions than they ever could as answered ones. Perhaps the mystery is not problem to be solved, but gift to be received, not gap to be filled, but space to be honoured, not failure of understanding, but triumph of creation over comprehension. The builders achieved what exceeds our understanding. They created what transcends our explanation. They left behind monuments to human capability that remind every generation that encounters them that the possible exceeds the imagined, that the actual transcends the theoretical, that what people have done demonstrates what people can do regardless of what circumstances seem to permit. The dawn light touches the peaks of the Kunlun Mountains first, gilding stone that contains pipes no theory fully explains. The light spreads eastward, reaching the pyramids as their shadows stretch westward across plains that once fed capital cities now remembered only in texts. The light touches museums where bronzes wait behind glass, their faces suddenly illuminated by rays that ancient craftsmen never saw, but that the eyes they created seem almost to welcome. The light reaches excavation sites where the night's moisture evaporates from earth, that covers cities where jade once signified power that water eventually claimed. The light touches walls that morning after morning have greeted the sun that no longer warms the inhabitants they once protected. The light reaches the cave entrances, stopping at thresholds that no dawn penetrates. Thresholds between the illuminated world above and the perpetual darkness below, where pillars support their impossible burdens in silence that millennia have not broken. The light connects them, as the darkness connected them, but differently. The darkness unified through obscurity, through the common mystery that night embodies. The light unifies through revelation, through the common visibility that day provides. But what the light reveals remains mysterious. Visibility does not produce transparency. Illumination does not generate understanding. The sights that morning light touches remain as enigmatic as the sights that night shrouded. Perhaps more enigmatic because daylight allows detailed observation that deepens rather than resolves the questions, that multiplies rather than answers the problems, that makes clearer exactly how unclear the fundamental issues remain. And so the cycle continues. Darkness and light, mystery and investigation, question and the absence of adequate answer. The sights endure through the cycle, their patience exceeding any human patience, their persistence outlasting any human persistence. They were here before we arrived to wonder at them. They will be here after we depart. They constitute a permanent horizon for human understanding, a boundary that defines the region within which our comprehension operates, a limit that every extension of knowledge reveals more clearly rather than transcending. But the limit is not defeat. The boundary is not prison. The horizon that these sites constitute is also an invitation to expand, to extend, to reach, toward what exceeds current grasp, even knowing that the reaching will not result in grasping. The pursuit matters regardless of completion. The effort signifies regardless of success. The engagement transforms regardless of conclusion. To genuinely confront these places, to honestly acknowledge what they represent, to humbly accept that they exceed us. This is not failure but wisdom, not limitation but liberation from the illusion that all mysteries must yield, that all questions must answer, that all enigmas must eventually resolve into the familiar categories that our understanding provides. The ancient peoples who built these places knew things we do not know. They achieved what we cannot achieve. They created what we cannot replicate. They left behind monuments to capabilities that our frameworks cannot encompass, to possibilities that our assumptions exclude, to actualities that our theories do not predict. They were human, as we are human. What they accomplished, humans accomplished. What they knew, humans knew. What they were, humans were, and therefore humans can be. The mystery they embody is not alien but intimate, not distant but near, not about others, fundamentally different from ourselves, but about ourselves as we have been and might again become. The morning mist rises from the caves of Liangzhu, from the fields around Xi'an, from the rivers that once fed Liangzhu, from the valleys beneath Shimao, from the plateau where Beigong rests in its mountain solitude. The mist lifts like a veil, revealing sights that will not reveal their secrets regardless of what investigation brings to bear. The mist dissipates as the sun climbs higher, as the day establishes itself across the Chinese landscape, as the sights settle into another cycle of light that will not illuminate what remains dark, a visibility that will not make visible what remains hidden, of presence that will not explain what remains absent from understanding. The sights endure, the mystery persists, the questions continue, the wonder remains, permanent and patient, waiting for those who come to encounter it, marking those who pause before it, connecting all who engage it across the vast reaches of time that separate the builders from ourselves. They built, we wonder, and in the wondering, something of what they were touches something of what we are, across the silence and the centuries and the impossibility of final understanding. They remain, those ancient peoples, in what they left behind. They continue in the mystery that continues. They persist in the questions that will not be answered, in the enigmas that will not resolve, in the wonders that will not cease to be wonderful however long investigation proceeds. The sun rises fully now, casting long light across a land that remembers what history has forgotten, that holds what understanding cannot contain, that keeps what time cannot entirely claim. Somewhere in the depths of a mountain in Qinghai, iron pipes rest in stone, waiting. Somewhere on the plains of Shanxi, pyramids stand above tombs, patient. Somewhere in a museum in Sichuan, bronze eyes catch the morning light, watching. Somewhere in collections scattered across the world, jade surfaces gleam with the polish that ancient hands applied, enduring. Somewhere on a ridge in northern Shanxi, fortress walls slowly return their stones to the earth that provided them, remembering. Somewhere beneath Zhejiang's hills, caves maintain their darkness against the day, holding silence that holds secrets that will not speak however carefully we listen. They are here. They have always been here. They will remain here long after we who wonder at them are ourselves wondered at by those who come after, by those who will stand where we stand now, puzzled as we are puzzled, awed as we are awed, touched by the same mystery that touches us, marked by the same encounter that marks us, connected through the same unanswerable questions to the same unreachable builders, across the same unbridgeable distance that neither time nor effort will ever fully span. This is the inheritance. This is the gift. This is what the ancient peoples, whoever they were, whatever they knew, however they achieved what they achieved, left for all who follow. Not answers, but the questions that make us human. Not knowledge, but the mystery that keeps us humble. Not certainty, but the wonder that never ends.